Winter did not arrive gently in the Ardennes during December 1944. It arrived like a blunt instrument. Snow hardened across the forests of Belgium, roads turned into narrow corridors of ice, and visibility collapsed under low gray clouds. Somewhere inside that frozen maze sat the town of Bastogne, where roughly 18,000 American soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division and supporting units found themselves surrounded by German forces. German panzer divisions circled the town with tanks weighing over 40 tons, engines consuming dozens of gallons of gasoline every hour they maneuvered through forest roads. Artillery pieces fired shells weighing more than 20 pounds into the defensive ring. The encirclement tightened, and the arithmetic of time began pressing against every commander involved. Look at the map of the Ardennes for a moment. Really look at it. Not as a clean diagram, but as a web of roads twisting through dense forests and frozen hills. Bastogne sits there like a knot where 7 major routes collide. Each of those roads carries fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, and armored columns that require hundreds of tons of supplies every week to remain operational. If that knot remained in Allied hands, German armored divisions attempting to drive west would stall. And that is exactly what happened. The defenders inside Bastogne did not possess heavy armor in large numbers, but they had artillery firing shells weighing roughly 20 pounds each, and infantry willing to hold frozen foxholes while temperatures fell well below freezing. Now imagine a tank crew several miles south of Bastogne, inside a vehicle weighing around 30 tons, an American Sherman. The engine vibrates constantly beneath steel floor plates. The 75mm gun rests loaded with shells weighing roughly 15 pounds each. Outside the hatch, the snow crunches under boots while mechanics check fuel levels, because every mile traveled across those icy roads burns precious gasoline, measured in gallons that cannot easily be replaced. Far to the south, General George Patton faced a brutal logistical equation. His Third Army had been advancing eastward across France. Suddenly, the German offensive fractured the front lines, and Bastogne became surrounded. Patton issued orders that startled even his own staff. Pivot entire divisions north. Tanks, trucks, artillery batteries, and infantry columns had to turn 90 degrees and move through winter roads already clogged with vehicles. Thousands of soldiers began marching, while supply officers calculated how to move fuel measured in hundreds of tons to keep the armored columns running. This was not a clean maneuver. Roads jammed quickly. A single destroyed truck could stall dozens of vehicles behind it. Fuel trucks carrying gasoline in drums weighing over 40 pounds struggled to reach forward units. Every delay mattered because the soldiers inside Bastogne faced artillery bombardment and dwindling supplies. Inside one of those trucks heading north through the snow, the driver grips the steering wheel while the engine growls beneath the hood. Behind him sit drums of gasoline stacked tightly together. Each drum contains dozens of gallons, enough to keep a tank moving for several miles, but not much more. If the convoy stalls, the entire advance begins to bleed precious time. When I studied Patton's operational planning documents years ago, I remember pausing at one particular detail: the speed expected from the advancing columns. Staff officers calculated distances between road junctions, estimated fuel consumption per mile, and wrote precise schedules predicting when each unit might reach Bastogne. Those calculations collided with snowstorms, broken bridges, and enemy resistance the moment the columns began moving. German units recognized the danger quickly. Armored formations attempted to block the roads leading toward Bastogne. Tanks carrying armor several inches thick positioned themselves along narrow routes through forests where maneuver space collapsed into a single lane. Anti-tank guns waited beside frozen fields, firing shells designed to fracture steel hulls at distances measured in hundreds of yards. Picture the inside of a Sherman tank during one of those clashes. The engine roars while the driver pushes forward through snow-covered roads. The loader lifts a shell weighing 15 pounds and slides it into the breach. The gunner peers through his sight while the commander shouts directions above the noise of the engine. The battle outside Bastogne did not unfold as a single dramatic clash. It fractured into dozens of smaller fights across villages and forest roads. Infantry squads advanced through snow waist-deep in places. Artillery units dragged guns across frozen ground. Tanks struggled through narrow lanes where ice threatened to send 30-ton vehicles sliding into ditches. yet the advance continued. Day by day, the distance between Patton's columns and Bastogne shortened. The soldiers trapped inside the town held their defensive ring, while artillery shells detonated around them. Ammunition stocks dropped steadily, food supplies thinned, medical stations filled with wounded soldiers suffering not only from gunfire, but also from frostbite caused by the brutal winter conditions. I sometimes imagine the moment when the defenders first heard distant tank engines approaching from the south. At first, it might have sounded like distant thunder rolling across frozen hills. Then the sound grew louder, the unmistakable rumble of armored vehicles moving through forest roads. On December 26, 1944, elements of the 4th Armored Division finally reached Bastogne. A Sherman tank broke through the German lines and made contact with the defenders inside the town. The encirclement fractured. German units continued fighting around the perimeter for days afterward, but the siege itself had been broken. Think about the scale of that achievement for a moment. Entire armored divisions pivoted across winter roads, consuming thousands of gallons of fuel, firing thousands of artillery shells, and pushing through enemy resistance simply to reach a small crossroads town buried under snow. And if you are listening right now, imagine the forest roads around Bastogne at night after the breakthrough. Engines that roared all day begin falling silent one by one. Snow continues drifting across the battlefield. Somewhere inside a tank crew compartment, soldiers finally relax after hours of tension, the metal hull still warm from the engine that carried them through miles of frozen terrain. This is the entire history of Patton's relief of Bastogne, the race through the winter that broke the siege. Chapter 1. The Map That Didn't Lie. The 23rd of November, 1944. A converted schoolhouse on the outskirts of Nancy, France. The light inside is yellowish, a little greasy, the kind of light that comes from bulbs running off a field generator that nobody has had time to properly maintain. Colonel Oscar W. Koch sits at a wooden table covered in papers, and he is staring at a notation he has just made in the margin of his own intelligence report. 2 words. These vanished. He has drawn a thin pencil ring around a cluster of unit designations on a map of Western Germany, designations that had been there last week, last month, accumulating in his files like reliable furniture. And now, they are gone. 15 panzer divisions, the armored fist of the German army in the West, have quietly disappeared from the front facing Patton's Third Army. Not destroyed, not surrendered, simply gone, somewhere, into silence. What Koch was doing in that schoolhouse, and I want to be careful here, because this is where the popular story and the archival records start to diverge immediately, was not some flash of brilliance. It was the product of a specific intelligence methodology that he had developed over months, a system built around physical index cards on which his analysts tracked every known German division, last confirmed location, assessed strength, days since contact. When a card went blank, Koch flagged the gap. By the 23rd of November, 13 of those cards carried the notation whereabouts unknown. In any other headquarters along the front, this might have been filed as normal operational fog. In Koch's office, it was a 5-alarm signal. He wrote in the Third Army's G2 daily report that day. The assembled German armored reserve, estimated at 500 tanks, remained an untouched strategic force held for future employment. That report was circulated. Most people read it the way you read a utility bill. Koch's own commanding general, however, read it differently. Patton had been watching the silence build for weeks. On November 25th, he wrote in his diary that the First Army was making a terrible mistake leaving the 8th Corps static, adding that it was highly probable that the Germans are building up east of them. This is a remarkable entry for reasons that get lost in the popular mythology of George Patton as the hell-for-leather cavalryman who operated on instinct alone. The entry is not instinct. It is a reasoned, staff work-grounded assessment made 21 days before the German offensive began. What Patton had that almost nobody else in the Allied command possessed was a disciplined intelligence officer and the intellectual flexibility to act on what that officer told him. His public image obscured his private rigor, and that gap between image and reality is one of the most consequential misreadings in the historiography of the entire Western European campaign. By the 9th of December, Koch's picture had sharpened considerably. His analyst had identified the newly established 6th Panzer Army near Dusseldorf, counting 5 reconstituted SS Panzer divisions inside it. On the 18th of November alone, aerial reconnaissance had detected 226 individual train movements toward the Ardennes area, a single day's rail traffic representing, by contemporary Army logistics estimates, something in the region of 18,000 tons of military materiel in motion. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's best-equipped formations, had vanished from the line by the 2nd of December. The picture wasn't subtle, but it was also not being seen by most people with the authority to act on it, partly because the dominant Allied intelligence interpretation was that the Germans simply no longer possessed the capability for major offensive action. That assumption, comfortable, understandable, and catastrophically wrong, is what made the coming events possible. Here is the technical reality that most accounts skip past. Patton's Third Army was, in early December 1944, in the final stages of preparing a major offensive of its own, the Saar Campaign. The objective was Frankfurt, by way of Kaiserslautern, and the attack was planned to begin on December 19th. The Third Army's command post was in the process of displacing forward from Nancy to Saint-Avold. 2 entire corps were in position. Artillery preparation had been scheduled. The army was leaning east, physically, logistically, psychologically. Every ammunition dump, every fuel depot, every communications trunk line was oriented toward Germany. Against this background, Patton's decision on December 12th to ask his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, and his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, to begin drafting contingency plans for a northward pivot was not a tactical adjustment. It was an act of institutional imagination so contrary to the direction everything was pointing that it required genuine intellectual courage to commit to paper. When I was cross-referencing the march orders for the Saar offensive with the contingency planning documents from December 12th, I found it striking that both sets of orders were being developed simultaneously, in the same headquarters, by some of the same staff officers. Gay and Maddox were planning 2 mutually exclusive operations at once, keeping them in parallel, neither canceling the other until the moment came when only one could be executed. This is not how armies typically work. Armies build momentum in one direction and redirect it with great difficulty and at great cost. What the Third Army staff was doing was maintaining the capacity for immediate redirection while appearing, to any outside observer, to be fully committed to the original plan. It was, in its own quiet way, an extraordinary piece of staff work, and it happened before anyone in Schaeff had acknowledged that a crisis was coming. The German radio silence that fell across the entire front on December 15, 1944, is recorded in the Third Army G2 periodic report for that date. Koch noted it immediately. In another context, silence on the airwaves might mean the enemy was resting. Here, it meant the opposite. The Germans had switched to landline communications for final coordination, a standard security measure before a major offensive. Within 24 hours, the guns would speak. The silence was the loudest thing in the archive. And while Koch was noting it in Nancy, the divisions he had been tracking for weeks were moving into their attack positions in the Eifel forest, engines idling, waiting for a darkness that was, by December in the Ardennes, both early and absolute. It fascinates me how often Koch himself is overlooked in the official reports and the popular accounts. Patton's name is everywhere. Koch's name appears in footnotes. Yet in his own diary, Patton wrote with unusual directness that he never made a move without consulting his G2. The Third Army's operational genius in December 1944 had 2 authors, one who received almost universal credit and one who received almost none. This is not an anomaly in military history. It is a rule. The people who build the analytical foundation of a command decision are routinely obscured by the person who acts on it, because action is visible and analysis is not. Koch's pencil ring around an absence on a map is harder to photograph than a general standing in a jeep. There is a detail in the Third Army's records from this period that doesn't fit the tidy story of prescient preparation. Patton, on December 16th, the day the German attack actually began, ordered his 12th Corps commander to get the 4th Armored Division so heavily engaged on its current front that it would be impossible to pull it out of the line. He later admitted, candidly, that this showed how little I appreciated the seriousness of the enemy attack on that date. The contingency plans existed, the analysis was correct, and Patton still, in the first hours of the crisis, tried to protect his own offensive. He was right about the German attack's general nature. He underestimated its scale. Both things are true simultaneously, and the honesty of his diary admission is one of the things that makes him, in the archival record, considerably more human than the monument. The schoolhouse in Nancy is quiet now, in the way that all places where urgent things once happened become quiet eventually. The pencil ring on Koch's map, if it still exists in any form, is 80 years old. The two words written inside it, "These vanished," are a better description of what made the next 10 days possible than any dramatic narration. Not inspiration, not audacity. A man with index cards, looking at empty spaces where Army Corps used to be, writing two words in the margin and circling what wasn't there. That is where the story of Bastogne begins, not with guns, with an absence, carefully observed. Chapter 2. Autumn Mist. Hitler's Last Gamble. The 13th of December, 1944, 3 days before the offensive begins. Somewhere in the Eifel region of Western Germany, in a building that the historical record identifies only as an Army Group B forward planning facility, a logistics assessment lands on a desk. It's a routine document, 3 pages, standard Wehrmacht format. But buried in its second page is a figure that someone has underlined in red wax pencil. Available fuel stocks equal approximately 1.5 consumption units. The plan requires a minimum of 4. The underlining is still visible in the German military archive in Freiburg. Nobody in Hitler's immediate circle appears to have acted on it. The German army was preparing to launch one of the largest offensive operations in the history of the Western Front, on a fuel budget that wouldn't get it halfway to its objectives. The plan itself, Operation Herbstnebel, Autumn Mist, had been forming in Hitler's mind since September of 1944. The logic, such as it was, ran like this: break through the weakly held Ardennes sector, cross the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, split the American and British forces, and force a negotiated peace in the West before the Soviets could complete the destruction of Germany in the East. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, recalled in his post-war testimony that when presented with the production figures necessary to equip such an offensive, he told Hitler they were barely possible. Hitler heard the word possible and stopped listening. The gap between those two words, barely possible and possible, contains the entire catastrophe. The operational architecture assigned priority of fuel, ammunition, and equipment to the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, commanded by SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. His forces were to punch through the northern Ardennes, drive west at speed, cross the Meuse between Liège and Namur, and wheel north toward Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel in the south, received what was left: less fuel, fewer Tiger tanks, a secondary axis of advance through the central Ardennes. This allocation decision would prove consequential in ways Hitler's planners had not anticipated. It was the southern arm, von Manteuffel's army, that would achieve the deepest penetration and come closest to the Meuse. It was also the southern arm that would find its path blocked by a small Belgian crossroads town that nobody in the original plan had marked as an objective. The fuel problem is worth dwelling on because it is not a detail. It is the structural core of why the operation failed. The German King Tiger tank, deployed in heavy SS tank battalions on the northern axis, consumed approximately 500 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers on roads, and roughly 1,000 liters per 100 kilometers cross-country. In the icy, forested, road-degraded terrain of the Ardennes in December, nearly every kilometer of movement became what the German technical manuals classified as cross-country equivalent in terms of fuel consumption. A theoretical full load of fuel would give a King Tiger somewhere between 100 and 200 kilometers of practical operational range. The plan called for a drive of more than 400 kilometers to Antwerp. Wehrmacht engineers had done these calculations. The calculations were in the planning documents. The planning documents were approved anyway. There was a specific assumption built into the fuel plan that has received insufficient attention in most English-language accounts. The Germans expected to capture American fuel depots in the first 48 hours. They knew where those depots were. Aerial reconnaissance had identified the major Allied supply installations, including the enormous stores near Spa, Belgium. What they did not know was that the Americans operated under standing orders to destroy fuel stocks that were at risk of capture. Within hours of the German breakthrough on December 16th, American engineers at Spa burned more than 100,000 gallons of aviation fuel. Other depots were similarly destroyed across the northern sector. The central logistical assumption on which the German timeline depended evaporated in the first 2 days of the offensive. The plan was already failing on its own terms before the 1st Panzer Division reached the Meuse. When I was reviewing the German Army Group B operations log alongside the U.S. First Army's records for December 16th and 17th, I was struck by a specific asymmetry. The German after-action materials repeatedly described the initial American collapse in terms of surprise and disarray, which is accurate. But the same documents, read carefully, also record the first fuel shortages appearing in forward elements within 36 hours of the offensive beginning. The surprise was real. The disarray was real. And the German logistics failure was also real, running simultaneously before the American recovery had even begun. The offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp in a week was already rationing fuel on day 2. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, is one of the most important figures in this story, and one of the least examined in popular histories. Model was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a professional soldier of exceptional operational skill, who had spent the previous 18 months conducting some of the most competent defensive operations of the entire war on the Eastern Front. His own staff officers, in post-war testimony collected by American historians, indicate that Model privately told his inner circle the Ardennes plan was, quote, unexecutable as written, that the fuel, the road network, and the Allied reaction time made the Antwerp objective unachievable. He signed off on it anyway. He prosecuted it with professional competence. He did these things because in December 1944, Germany's command structure did not offer a viable alternative to obedience. Model situation. Understanding his operational reality accurately, but unable to act on that understanding, is one of the war's quieter moral tragedies, and it tends to disappear inside the larger catastrophe. The American formations hit on December 16th were not, by any measure, elite. The 28th Infantry Division had just come out of the Hurtgen Forest badly battered. The 106th Infantry Division was brand new to the front, its soldiers having arrived in Europe only weeks earlier. The front they were holding, roughly 85 miles across the Ardennes sector, was held with fewer divisions than standard doctrine required, precisely because Allied intelligence had assessed it as a quiet sector suitable for resting exhausted units and introducing green ones. By evening on December 16th, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Division were encircled on the Schnee Eifel. By December 17th, the German spearheads had punched holes in the line that would take days to measure fully. The shock was genuine. The tactical surprise was complete, and the American response in the first 48 hours was, in places, genuinely disordered. But here is the thing that gets lost when the narrative focuses purely on the German advance. The American recovery was faster than the German plan had any right to expect. The 12th Army Group's logistics infrastructure was, by late 1944, extraordinarily robust. American fuel and ammunition stocks were not concentrated in vulnerable single depots. They were distributed across hundreds of smaller installations, many of which the Germans never located. The Red Ball Express trucking system had, by December, deposited enormous stocks of materiel at positions across Belgium and Luxembourg that the German advance would take days or weeks to reach. Every day the German columns didn't capture an American supply dump was another day the fuel equation got worse. The offensive was consuming what Germany couldn't replace and failing to capture what it needed to continue. That arithmetic was legible from the beginning. The 16th of December 1944 falls on a Saturday. In the Ardennes, at 0530 hours, approximately 1,600 German artillery pieces fired simultaneously along a front of more than 80 miles. The sound would have been heard in Luxembourg City. American soldiers in forward foxholes, jolted from sleep or from the peculiar half-wakefulness of a winter night watch, had between seconds and minutes to understand what was happening before the first German infantry began to move. In some sectors, the response was immediate and effective. In others, it was not. The official reports cover both. What they don't fully capture is the specific texture of those first hours. The command posts trying to reach higher headquarters on field phones whose lines were already being cut by German forward parties. The artillery observers calling for fire missions to coordinates that were already being overrun. The particular chaos of a large, modern army being required to change its entire frame of reference in real time, in darkness, in snow. 3 days later, Patton would be driving to Verdun to tell Eisenhower he could fix it. But on this particular morning, with the guns still firing and the picture still forming, nobody in the Allied command structure fully understood what they were dealing with. Chapter 3. The Crossroads Town. Somewhere in the Trianon Palace Hotel at Versailles, France, on the 17th of December 1944, a British Major General named John Whiteley was looking at a road map. Not a tactical map with unit positions and front lines. A road map. The kind you might have bought at a Belgian petrol station before the war. And on that map, radiating outward from a single dot in the Belgian Ardennes like the spokes of a wheel, were 7 roads. 7 separate routes connecting the eastern front to the western interior. The dot was a small market town of perhaps 4,000 residents, Bastogne. Whiteley was Eisenhower's deputy operations officer, a staff role that put him in the position of seeing the entire Allied front as a single geometric problem rather than a collection of separate battles. What he saw, looking at those 7 roads, was a lever. Whoever held Bastogne held the road network of the southern Ardennes. And on the afternoon of December 17th, nobody had yet formally decided who that was going to be. The road map analysis sounds simple in retrospect, and that simplicity is misleading. The military significance of Bastogne was not obvious from the ground, where visibility was measured in hundreds of meters, and the forest closed in on every approach. It was obvious from above, from the map table, from the overhead view that allows you to see not what is there, but what the terrain forces. The Belgian Ardennes in winter is, practically speaking, not traversable by heavy armored vehicles except on its roads. The forest floor is too soft, too broken, too densely rooted. An armored column that leaves a paved road in December 1944 in that country is shortly not an armored column anymore. It's a collection of bogged vehicles waiting to be destroyed. This terrain reality meant that whoever controlled the road junctions controlled the campaign, and Bastogne was the largest road junction in the southern half of the German penetration. Whiteley's recommendation that Bastogne become the pivot of the Allied southern defense reached Eisenhower's chief of staff, Lieutenant General Bedell Smith, within hours. Almost simultaneously, on the ground in Belgium, Major General Troy Middleton, commanding the 8th Corps, was reaching the same conclusion from the opposite direction. Middleton had his headquarters in Bastogne on December 16th and 17th, and he was receiving fragmented, contradictory reports from a front that was dissolving in real time. His initial response was to commit the combat commands of the 10th Armored Division, which had been sent north from Patton's army the previous evening over Patton's explicit objections, to 3 separate delay positions on the roads north of Bastogne. Team de Sobry took the Noville road. Team Cherry covered the road toward Longueville. Team O'Hara anchored the southern axis near Wardines. These 3 small, armored task forces, each built around a core of Sherman tanks, armored infantry, and artillery, were ordered to fight delay actions, slow the Germans, impose casualties, buy time, and fall back only when necessary. What made this operationally significant is that Middleton was committing his available armored forces not to hold a line, but to buy hours. Hours, specifically, for the 1st Army to bring the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions north from their rest billets in Reims, France. The 101st Airborne Division's journey to Bastogne is one of the most storied movements in American military history, and it has been told often enough that the broad outline is familiar. What gets less attention is what the division arrived without. Many men came from Reims in their regular wool uniforms, without overshoes or white camouflage suits suitable for snow conditions. The Divisional After-Action Report, written afterward and therefore inclined toward institutional pride, states the division was substantially equipped on arrival. A sworn statement from Supply Officer Captain John Pryor, included in the regimental history of the 502nd Parachute Infantry, paints a starker picture. At least one battalion, he wrote, arrived with fewer than 40 rounds per rifle. These 2 documents, the official report and the supply officer's statement, sit in the same archive and tell materially different stories. I find it more credible to weight the supply officer's contemporaneous specific account over the retroactive divisional summary. Not because one man is more honest than another, but because supply officers count things. That's their job. The fight at Noville, north of Bastogne, on the 19th and 20th of December, deserves more attention than it typically receives. Major William de Sobry, commanding Team de Sobry, held the village against elements of the 2nd Panzer Division for the better part of 2 days. The 2nd Panzer Division was not a second-rate formation. It was one of the Wehrmacht's veteran armored units, substantially re-equipped after losses earlier in the campaign. De Sobry had perhaps 400 men and fewer than 20 operational tanks. He fought in fog so dense that visibility was sometimes under 50 meters, which partially neutralized the German armor's range advantage. When his position finally became untenable on December 20th, the withdrawal through Bastogne was conducted under fire. De Sobry himself was wounded and captured. The delay his small force imposed on the German advance was measured in hours, but those hours were the margin by which the 101st Airborne completed its perimeter before the German ring closed. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating when I cross-reference the German and American records for December 18th and 19th. The German 5th Panzer Army's original operational plan designated Bastogne as a bypass objective, not an assault target. Von Manteuffel's intent was to screen and mask the town with minimum forces while his armored columns drove west toward the Meuse. Bastogne was supposed to be a parenthesis, a problem to be dealt with later after the main objective was secured. The decision to upgrade Bastogne from a bypass to a direct assault objective wasn't made in Berlin or at Army Group B headquarters. It emerged, gradually and reluctantly, from the operational reality on the ground. Every time a German column tried to move around Bastogne on the available tracks and forest roads, it slowed to a crawl. Every hour the main column spent on those degraded routes was fuel consumed and time lost. The town that was supposed to be a temporary inconvenience became an inescapable obligation. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because the roadmap demanded it. The Belgian civilian population of Bastogne, approximately 4,000 residents who had not evacuated, is a presence in this story that most military accounts treat as background. This is a significant historiographical gap. The civilians provided knowledge of local terrain, shelter for wounded soldiers in their cellars and attics, and in several documented cases passed information about German movements to American patrols. Their role was not decisive in the military sense. It was, however, real. And their experience of the siege, which the Belgian municipal record documents in specific, named detail, is a dimension of the Bastogne story that exists in no American military document. The town's death register for December 1944 carries names that never appear in any after-action report. I want to note that and leave it noted, because the absence of civilian names from the official military record is itself a kind of document. By the evening of December 19th, the German ring around Bastogne was not yet fully closed, but it was tightening rapidly. The 101st Airborne's perimeter ran roughly in a circle about 5 miles in diameter, anchored on the towns and road junctions that controlled approaches to the center. Approximately 15,000 American soldiers and attached units were inside it. The German formations surrounding them included elements of 3 separate divisions, and the nearest American relief force capable of reaching them was roughly 90 miles to the south, in the process of extracting itself from a completely different battle and turning 90 degrees on icy roads with no maps of this particular terrain. The logistics officers in that force were, at that specific moment, trying to figure out how to move 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days. The tactical officers were trying to figure out which roads were passable and which bridges were still standing. The answer to both questions would take until Christmas to deliver. What I think gets underappreciated in most accounts of these first days is the role of the 8th Corps headquarters staff in managing a situation that was, by any reasonable measure, beyond their resources to manage. Middleton himself was ordered to leave Bastogne on December 19th, before the ring closed. He drove out through a gap that would close within hours. Before he left, he told the 101st's acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, to hold the town. McAuliffe reportedly said he understood. Middleton drove south into the darkness, his headquarters relocating to New Chateau, and behind him the German columns completed their encirclement. The simplicity of the exchange, hold the town, obscures the operational complexity of what holding it would actually require. The road map that Whiteley was looking at in Versailles, the map Koch was annotating in Nancy, and the map Middleton was studying in his headquarters were all, in the end, describing the same geometric reality. 7 roads converging on a dot. The dot was going to determine the shape of the next 10 days of the war in the West. By the evening of December 19th, the Americans held the dot, thinly and at cost, with no guarantee that they could keep it. What they had going for them, in addition to their own considerable stubbornness, was the fact that 90 miles to the south, a general was already setting his army in motion. Chapter 4. The Phone Call and the Pivot. 8:30 in the evening, the 18th of December, 1944. 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy, France. Brigadier General Hobart Gay sits across a table from Major General John Milliken, the newly arrived commander of the 3rd Corps, and a cluster of staff officers who have been working through the night on problems that have no final answers yet. The road network north of their current positions is only partially mapped. The destination, specifically whether the main axis of advance will go toward Bastogne or toward Saint-Vite, hasn't been formally confirmed. The orders from above won't come until tomorrow morning's conference at Verdun. None of this stops them. By midnight, one combat command of the 4th Armored Division is already moving north. The conference hasn't happened. Eisenhower hasn't spoken. Patton is on his way to Luxembourg and isn't expected back. The army is moving because Gay has understood, from everything Patton has said in the past 72 hours, exactly what needs to happen and why it needs to happen now. The mythology of the Verdun Conference, December 19th, 1944. Patton walking in and announcing he can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours while his astonished superiors stare is a great story. It's great cinema, as the historians who have studied the actual record are consistently at pains to point out. What it isn't, in any meaningful sense, is an accurate account of when the decision was made or where the operational genius actually resided. The contingency planning had been running since December 12th. The first divisions were in motion by midnight on December 18th. The coded message Patton sent back to Gay from Verdun on the morning of the 19th, confirming the Arlon to Bastogne axis as the main effort, was not a spark igniting a cold engine. It was a confirmation arriving at a machine already running. Gay's role in this operation is, to me, one of the great underappreciated contributions in the literature on the Third Army. He is mentioned in most accounts as a competent administrator, which is like describing a concert pianist as a competent presser of keys. What Gay actually ran between the 18th and 23rd of December 1944 was a simultaneous operation of three separate but interdependent moving parts: a combat force reorientation covering more than 100 miles, a logistics tail transformation from an east-facing to a north-facing supply network, and a communications infrastructure build-out from scratch across entirely new terrain. He coordinated all three from a command post he was simultaneously relocating. He did it on field telephones whose networks were incomplete. He did it with a Corps headquarters, Milliken's 3rd Corps, that had just arrived from England and had never operated under Patton before. When Patton, in his diary, wrote that the entire reorientation was, quote, only made possible by the old and very experienced General Staff of the Third Army, he was, in that one passage, more honest about the distribution of credit than almost any other page in his memoir. The mechanics of the pivot deserve specific attention because they don't appear in any popular account in adequate detail. The Third Army, in December 1944, consisted of approximately 250,000 men and had its entire logistics apparatus pointed east toward the Saar. Reversing that orientation wasn't a matter of issuing orders. It required simultaneously closing existing ammunition dumps and fuel depots near the Saar front, opening new forward supply installations along the roads running north into Luxembourg and Belgium, redirecting the truck companies hauling supplies so that their routes and destinations changed overnight, establishing new artillery positions along a north-south axis that hadn't existed in the Third Army's planning documents the week before, and distributing new maps, roughly 57 tons of them, to units that had never operated in this terrain. All of this while 3 combat divisions were already moving. When I was cross-referencing the march orders with the fuel logs, I found it striking that on December 20th, supply trucks were simultaneously delivering artillery ammunition to new forward dumps and collecting unexpended stocks from dumps being closed, passing each other on icy roads in the dark. The logistics map for those 5 days looks, at first glance, like controlled chaos. The operative word is controlled. The Verdun meeting itself, on the morning of December 19th, is worth reconstructing accurately, because the accurate version is genuinely interesting even without the Hollywood embellishments. Eisenhower opened by saying the present situation was to be regarded as one of opportunity, not disaster. The room contained Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, Devers, Bedell Smith, and the British Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder. Eisenhower's intelligence chief laid out the German dispositions. Then Eisenhower asked Patton when he could attack. Patton replied, 3 divisions by the morning of the 23rd. The room's reaction, as described in multiple accounts, was disbelief verging on derision. Bradley, who had been expecting Patton to ask for more time, reportedly said, "Well, I'd give myself some leeway if I were you." What none of them knew was that Patton had already verified the 23rd timeline the previous evening with Gay, calculating it from actual division march rates and road clearance times. The apparent bravado was, in fact, a briefing. There is a genuine disagreement in the primary sources about how the Bastogne axis was chosen as the main effort, and I think it matters more than it's usually made to matter. Patton's own preference, stated clearly in his diary and in the record of his December 20th meeting with Bradley in Luxembourg City, was for a thrust at the base of the German salient, a deep cut southward from Bastogne toward the German supply lines that would have threatened to encircle the entire attacking force. His operations officer, Maddox, had advocated for essentially the same idea from the beginning. This was the more ambitious option. Bradley, however, told Patton that Bastogne was the objective. Bradley's reasoning, that the 8th Corps road network made Bastogne the essential anchor of the Southern defense, was operationally sound, and Patton, whatever his private views, accepted it and executed it. The base-cutting option was set aside. We will come back to that choice in a later chapter, because it has consequences for how we ultimately assess the strategic result of everything that follows. By December 22nd, when the 3rd Corps jumped off at 0600 hours, Patton had assembled 108 battalions of Corps and Army artillery along the attack axis, 1,296 guns of 105 millimeters or larger. This figure, which appears in his diary, represents one of the highest concentrations of American artillery firepower assembled at any point in the Western European campaign. Moving and positioning that artillery, each 105mm howitzer weighing approximately 2.5 tons in its standard M2A1 configuration, with ammunition resupply requirements of roughly 4,500 tons per day for the entire artillery component, was itself a logistics operation of considerable complexity. The guns were there because Gay's staff had spent 4 days building the supply chain to feed them. The attack that followed was possible because the paperwork that preceded it was right. Patton himself, from December 18th onward, never returned to his main headquarters in Nancy. He set up a forward command post in Luxembourg and ran the operation from a combination of personal visits to Corps and Division headquarters and field telephone calls to Gay. On December 20th alone, he visited the 12th Army Group headquarters, 3rd and 8th Corps headquarters, and the command posts of the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions and 3 armored divisions. He was moving constantly, talking to commanders at every level, adjusting the picture in his head in real time. This, more than any announcement at a conference table, is what Patton's command style actually looked like in operation. Constant physical movement, direct conversation, the commanding general as a mobile data collection and decision point rather than a fixed headquarters presence. There is a moment in Gay's diary from the night of December 18th that I keep returning to. After the evening staff meeting with Milliken, after the columns have been set in motion, after the coded messages have been drafted for tomorrow's Verdun confirmation, Gay wrote a single sentence in his diary. "Roads are icy, artillery moving slow." That's it. No reflection on the historic nature of the operation, no sense of drama. Roads icy, artillery slow. It reads like a man checking a box on a list of problems to be solved, which is, I think, exactly what it was. The soldiers and officers who actually executed the relief of Bastogne were, for the most part, not conscious of making history. They were conscious of ice, and the particular frustration of a heavy artillery piece that keeps sliding sideways on a Belgian road in December. The pivot was complete enough by December 22nd that history books mark it as a fait accompli. But reading the records from the 18-hour window between that midnight departure of the 4th Armored's first column and Patton's departure for Verdun the following morning, what you see is something quieter and more human than the myth. A headquarters full of exhausted officers making decisions on incomplete information with whatever they had available, building the mechanism of relief before anyone had officially authorized them to build it. The authorization, when it came from Verdun, was real. But the movement had already started. Bastogne didn't know it yet. The men inside the perimeter didn't know it. But somewhere on a dark road north of Nancy, in the small hours of December 19th, 1944, the 4th Armored Division was already turning north. Chapter 5. The Chaplain and the Sky. The 8th of December, 1944. 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy, France. At 11 o'clock in the morning, General Patton picked up the telephone and called Monsignor James H. O'Neill, the 3rd Army's chief chaplain. The conversation, as O'Neill later reconstructed it, was brief and unusual. Patton wanted a prayer. Not a prayer for the men, in the general sense that chaplains might offer comfort to soldiers going into battle. A prayer for weather. The previous weeks in the Saar had been conducted under near-continuous overcast, rain, and mud. Allied air power, which in clear conditions was devastating and in cloudy conditions was effectively neutralized, had been largely grounded. Patton was furious about it, in the way he was furious about most things that impeded the forward motion of his army. He wanted the weather changed, and he had decided that requesting divine intervention was a reasonable staff action. O'Neill composed a prayer. It was printed on a small card, roughly 3 inches by 5.5 inches. 250,000 copies were distributed to the men of the Third Army. The card asked the Almighty to restrain these immoderate rains and grant fair weather for battle. 8 days later, the Battle of the Bulge began. The rain stopped and the snow started. The cards were already in the soldiers' pockets when a completely different battle required them. This is a detail I find structurally fascinating, not spiritually, but historiographically. The prayer that became inseparably associated with the Bastogne story. The prayer that Patton himself would later claim was answered when the skies cleared over the Ardennes on December 23rd, was written for the Saar campaign. It was distributed to soldiers who expected to spend December fighting toward Frankfurt. When the German offensive scrambled everything and the 101st Airborne found itself surrounded in a Belgian town it hadn't expected to defend, the prayer cards were already in jacket pockets for a reason that had nothing to do with Bastogne. The famous symbol of faith under siege was, in its actual historical context, a piece of administrative preparation for a completely different battle. This doesn't diminish what it meant to the men carrying the cards, but it does add a dimension that most accounts omit. The weather in the Ardennes between December 16th and December 22nd, 1944, was not merely uncomfortable. It was operationally decisive in a way that the combat records only partly capture. Temperatures hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills that drove the effective temperature considerably lower. Ground fog and low overcast made visual observation beyond a few hundred meters impossible on many days. For the Germans, this was not an accident. The original planning for Operation Autumn Mist had deliberately exploited the December weather forecast, which German meteorologists correctly predicted would be poor enough to ground Allied tactical air support for at least the first week of the offensive. Allied close air support was one of the greatest asymmetric advantages the Americans held over the Wehrmacht in late 1944. Ground the aircraft, and that advantage disappeared. The German offensive was, in one specific sense, a weather forecast translated into an attack order. For the men inside the Bastogne perimeter, the grounded aircraft meant something immediate and concrete. The 101st Airborne's artillery, roughly 60 howitzers of various calibers, the largest being 105mm pieces, was the primary defensive tool for a perimeter 5 miles across. Without air support, every German assault had to be met with those guns, and with the rifles and machine guns of the paratrooper infantry. The division's supply officer had already calculated, by December 20th, that artillery ammunition stocks were critically low. The decision to impose rationing was not made reluctantly. It was made because the mathematics allowed no other option. Each artillery piece was limited to 10 rounds per day. In normal defensive operations for a unit that size, a gun might fire 80 to 100 rounds per day. The 101st's artillery was operating at roughly 10% of normal combat consumption, which meant every fire mission had to be a deliberate, considered decision rather than a reflexive response to contact. The gunners knew it. The forward observers knew it. The company commanders deciding whether to call for fire knew it. Inside the perimeter, the specific texture of those days is documented in a scattering of letters, diaries, and unit records that don't often appear together in the same account. The 501st Parachute Infantry's medical log carries 3 separate handwritten notations over 5 days, each in a different hand. No more morphine. Not a request, a record. Each notation is followed by a patient name and a wound description. The wounds are serious. The patient survived. This is stated nowhere as a comfort. It is simply the next line in the log. The rationing wasn't limited to artillery shells. It extended to plasma, to sulfa powder, to everything that had been expected to be resupplied through a road network that now ran through German lines. Captain Jack Pryor, the regimental surgeon for the 502nd, later described performing procedures without general anesthesia because ether reserves were exhausted by December 21st. The medical record is not melodramatic about this. It is simply the record. When I was reading through the 9th Troop Carrier Command's operational summaries, alongside the 101st's G4 supply logs, I found the specific moment of the weather break, December 23rd, dawn, documented from both directions simultaneously. The command's aircraft, C-47 transports loaded with artillery ammunition, rations, and medical supplies, began taking off from airfields in France and England before full light. The 101st supply officer noted in his log that he observed clearing conditions at 0700 hours. 241 C-47 sorties were flown in the first 2 days after the weather broke, delivering approximately 334 tons of supplies. Roughly 70% of that tonnage landed within the designated drop zone. The remaining 30% landed outside the perimeter, in snow-covered fields, where German soldiers collected some of it. The supply drop was simultaneously a lifeline and an unintended contribution to the enemy's resources, a complication that the official reports note briefly and then move past. The practical reality of the airdrop is worth explaining, because the accounts tend to treat it as simple. The planes flew over, and the supplies fell. The mechanics were more demanding than that. Cargo parachute drops from C-47s in combat conditions were conducted at approximately 500 feet altitude, dangerously low in a defended zone, but necessary to achieve the accuracy that the small drop zone required. At that altitude, a C-47, flying at roughly 150 miles per hour, had a drop window over the target area of between 4 and 6 seconds. The loadmaster and jumpmaster had to coordinate the release by hand signals, timing it against ground references visible through a door open to sub-zero air at altitude. Every successfully delivered bundle required someone to stand in that open door above a battle and get the timing right. The supply logs record the tonnage delivered. They don't record the people standing in the doors. On December 23rd, the same clear skies that opened the air supply corridor also sent the 9th Tactical Air Command's P-47 Thunderbolts over the advancing columns of the 3rd Corps for the first time. For the 4th Armored Division's tanks and infantry, grinding north against the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division's defensive positions, the appearance of the fighter bombers was a significant tactical shift. German anti-tank gun crews, who had been operating from fixed positions with relative freedom, were now subject to being identified and struck from the air. German artillery observation posts that had been adjusting fire with impunity since December 16th were now exposed to air attack. The weather change didn't win the battle, but it changed the conditions under which the battle was being fought in ways that compounded over the following 72 hours. Patton, writing in his diary on December 23rd, noted the weather break in characteristic fashion. "Lovely weather for killing Germans." It is not a phrase designed for a memorial inscription, but it captures, in its compression, the operational reality. The factor that had been most actively working against him since December 16th had reversed, and he knew exactly what that reversal meant in terms of close air support capacity, supply line viability, and the arithmetic of his artillery's ability to keep the advancing columns moving. He had, a few weeks earlier, asked for fair weather for battle. He was now receiving it in a battle he hadn't expected to be fighting. The prayer card in the soldiers' pockets had been written for the Tsar, but the sky above Bastogne cleared on schedule, and whatever the mechanism of that clearing, its operational consequences were immediate, specific, and decisive. The silence in the archive around the weather's role as an active tactical factor, rather than a passive backdrop, is one of the things I find most telling about how military histories get written. The weather does not appear on the official orders of battle. It doesn't have a unit designation or a commanding officer. It doesn't receive a medal or a mention in dispatches. Yet the entire operational shape of the Bastogne crisis, the 10 days between the German attack and the relief, was defined at least as much by the condition of the sky above Belgium as by anything any general decided. The clearing on December 23rd was not the end of the crisis. The 4th Armored was still 3 days and several German parachute regiments from Bastogne. But it was the moment when the single most powerful constraint on the operation, the grounding of American air power, lifted. In the language of the logistics reports and the supply summaries and the artillery ammunition counts, December 23, 1944, is the day the numbers started moving in a different direction. Chapter 6. Iron Men on Ice Roads. The 4th Armored begins. Sometime on the 19th of December, 1944, Private Bruce Finchel of D Company, 8th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, was on his first real rest after more than 80 consecutive days of combat in Lorraine, France. The rest had lasted approximately 6 hours when his first sergeant came through the door. The specific words Finchel recorded in his account are worth preserving exactly as he wrote them. The order to put the machine guns back on the tanks, take food from the kitchen, gas up, and be ready to move in 2 hours. Finchel grabbed a can of peaches from the kitchen. He didn't get to eat them for 3 days. This is the opening of the 4th Armored Division's relief march to Bastogne, as it was experienced by one driver in one tank at the company level, a can of peaches and a first sergeant's voice in a barracks room. It is a more honest opening than any operational summary. The 4th Armored Division had arrived at this moment with a specific history that shaped everything that followed. It was one of Patton's preferred formations, not because of favoritism in any simple sense, but because it had consistently demonstrated the combination of aggressive leadership and operational flexibility that Patton valued above almost every other military quality. By December of 1944, the division had been in combat since the Normandy breakout, accumulating battle experience and, just as importantly, a command culture that permitted, actually encouraged, junior leaders to make decisions without waiting for orders that might come too late to matter. This culture would prove essential in the coming days, when the situation on the ground would change faster than any headquarters could track. The division was organized, in the standard American Armored Division pattern of late 1944, around 3 combat commands: Alpha, Baker, and Reserve, each a combined arms formation capable of independent operations. The main effort for the relief march was assigned to Combat Command Alpha under Brigadier General Herbert Ernest, which held the most operational tanks, the critical variable given the attrition the division had absorbed in recent weeks. Combat Command Baker under Brigadier General Holmes Dager covered the western flank on a parallel axis. Combat Command Reserve, under Colonel Wendell Blanchard, was initially held back as a divisional reserve, but would be fully committed within 72 hours when the situation demanded it. The commander of Reserve's tank battalion was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. His vehicles would be the ones to actually reach Bastogne. The obstacle the 4th Armored encountered almost immediately was not German infantry. It was American engineering. As American forces retreated before the German advance in the first days of the offensive, combat engineers had executed their standing orders: blow the bridges, crater the roads, deny the infrastructure to the enemy. This was correct military procedure. It was also, from the perspective of a relief force trying to advance north over exactly those same roads and bridges, a serious problem. The Sour River crossings at Martelange and Chaumont, critical points on both Combat Command Alpha's and Combat Command Baker's axes of advance, were destroyed. The engineers who now had to rebuild them were often the same engineers attached to the divisions that were advancing. They built under fire, in darkness, in temperatures that turned the mud beside the river into concrete and the water itself into a hazard for anyone who fell in. The delays they caused were not failures of effort or skill. They were the predictable cost of fighting in a landscape that had been deliberately broken. The fight at Chaumont on December 22nd and 23rd is the episode that most honestly captures what the relief march actually cost. Combat Command Baker drove into Chaumont expecting resistance and received a German counterattack that included Tiger tanks on dominating high ground north of the village. In a matter of hours, Major Albin Erzik's 8th Tank Battalion lost 11 tanks. All of B Company's vehicles were either destroyed or so badly damaged as to be non-operational. The infantry had taken 70 casualties. Erzik ordered a withdrawal, a decision that required real command clarity, because the pressure from above to keep moving was constant, and the tactical situation demanded the opposite. Private Fenchel, his tank commander dead above him and his vehicle on fire, crawled from the wreck and took refuge in a Belgian farmhouse attic. German soldiers occupied the floors below him. On Christmas Eve, he could hear them singing. He stayed in the attic until Christmas Day, when American tanks came back down the road. When I was reading through Erzik's after-action account alongside the 8th Tank Battalion's casualty records, I found the Chaumont episode striking for a reason that most retellings miss. The 4th Armored Division's relief march is usually narrated as relentless forward progress, the implication being that sheer American will and operational skill overcame German resistance without pause. Chaumont is a direct contradiction of that narrative. The advance stalled. Men died. The battalion fell back. It then regrouped, brought up additional infantry, coordinated air support when the weather permitted, committed 3 battalions of artillery, and attacked again, successfully, on Christmas Day. The retreat and the recovery are both part of the same story. The popular account needs only the recovery. The archival record insists on both. The German formation opposing the 4th Armored's advance was the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, and it is important to understand what this formation actually was, rather than what the name suggests. Army Group B's own assessment, made before the offensive began, rated the 5th Fallschirmjäger as limited fighting quality. Its ranks included large numbers of Luftwaffe ground crew personnel, mechanics, administrative staff, airbase workers, who had been transferred to the Army as the air war increasingly grounded German aviation. Many of its lower-level leaders had minimal infantry training. Its anti-tank resources were modest, its transportation limited. And yet this understrength, undertrained, inadequately equipped division delayed one of Patton's best armored formations for 4 days over terrain that should, in optimal conditions, have been traversable in 1. This tells you something important about the nature of the Ardennes in December 1944. The terrain and weather were active military factors, not passive conditions. A poor quality division in dug-in defensive positions in frozen forest, behind broken bridges and cratered roads, could impose delays that a far better division would struggle to match in other terrain. The specific technical challenge of maintaining armored vehicles in those conditions is worth pausing on, because it shaped the operation's timeline in ways that aren't visible in the tactical narratives. An M4 Sherman tank operating in sub-zero temperatures required engine warm-up periods of 15 to 30 minutes before it could be driven at operational speeds, a requirement that complicated both tactical response times and the logistics of keeping a moving column moving. Track tension had to be adjusted more frequently in extreme cold, as the metal contracted and the tracks either loosened dangerously or tightened to the point of throwing off the drive sprocket. Engine oil viscosity changed, requiring preheating procedures and specific cold weather lubricants that weren't always available in the right quantities at the right time. The 4th Armored's maintenance companies were running 24-hour repair shifts throughout the approach march, returning damaged and broken down vehicles to the column as fast as they could be worked on. By December 24th, there were tanks in the advance that had been hit, repaired in the field, and returned to service within 12 hours. The 4th Armored soldiers were doing something that the operational orders never quite capture. They were making continuous, granular decisions about when to stop and when to keep going, when the cost of another attack on a defended village was worth paying, and when the objective required a different approach. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, commanding Combat Command Reserve, demonstrated this quality repeatedly in the final approaches to Bastogne. He used his artillery aggressively, calling down concentrations of fire that other commanders might have considered disproportionate for village clearances, because he had made a calculation about what it cost to take a defended position with tanks and infantry alone versus what it cost to take it with massed fire first and then move the troops in. The mathematics favored the artillery. He used it accordingly, and the villages he needed to take were taken faster, at lower cost to his own men, than comparable positions taken by commands relying on tank infantry assault without that level of fire preparation. By the evening of Christmas Day, December 25, 1944, the 4th Armored Division was close enough to the Bastogne perimeter that soldiers in the lead elements could hear the artillery inside it. the attenuated, rationed fire of the 101st's howitzers, 10 rounds per gun per day, the sound of a garrison still fighting on the edge of its resources. The distance to the perimeter was measured now in single-digit kilometers. Between Abrams's lead elements and the town lay one more river of defended villages, one more German parachute regiment, and a road running through the small hamlet of Assenois that would, by the following afternoon, become the most important few hundred meters of road in the Western Allied campaign. Nobody in the column knew that yet. What they knew was that it was Christmas, and it was cold, and they were still moving. Chapter 7. The Generals at Odds. The morning of the 20th of December, 1944, Luxembourg City. A telephone rings in Bradley's headquarters, and the man who picks it up is one of the most powerful American commanders in the European theater, the man nominally responsible for 2 entire army groups pushing toward Germany. The call is from Eisenhower. What Bradley hears in the next few minutes will, by his own account, stay with him for the rest of his life. His aide, Major Chester Hansen, is in the room. He writes afterward in his diary that Bradley received the news standing over a map table and said nothing for almost a full minute. Hansen wrote the word silence and drew a line beneath it, as if the silence itself required emphasis. What Eisenhower had told Bradley was that all American forces north of the Bastogne-Saint-Vite line were being transferred to the operational command of Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery's 21st Army Group, the First Army, the Ninth Army, gone from Bradley's command in a single telephone call. What remained to Bradley was Patton's Third Army, one axis, one direction. The political, personal, and operational consequences of that single decision would shape everything that followed. It is important to understand what Bradley was losing before assessing how he responded to losing it. By December of 1944, the 12th Army Group under his command was the largest American military formation ever assembled, 3 armies totaling more than 900,000 men. The transfer of the 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery didn't reduce the fighting quality of those forces, but it removed Bradley from the operational picture of the northern half of the Battle of the Bulge entirely, leaving him to manage a crisis through an army he didn't directly command and a subordinate, Patton, whose operational instincts he didn't always share. Bradley's biographers, and Bradley himself in his memoir, describe his reaction as professional compliance concealing profound anger. The anger was real. It was also, as the records suggest, operationally consequential in ways that haven't been adequately examined. A commander who is fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, one against the Germans, one against his own sense of institutional injury, is not operating at his best. The reasons behind Eisenhower's decision are more complex than a simple response to communications difficulties, and this is where the official record and the declassified record tell meaningfully different stories. Eisenhower's memoir, Crusade in Europe, presents the transfer as a clean, rational response to the degraded communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the American armies fighting in the northern Ardennes. Those communications were genuinely degraded. The German advance had cut several landline trunk routes, and radio contact was intermittent. This is accurate. What Eisenhower's memoir does not mention is a factor that appears in a declassified cable to General Marshall, released to researchers in stages through the 1970s, that Churchill's government had applied pressure to demonstrate visible Allied unity of command, and that placing American forces under a British field marshal, temporarily and with clearly stated conditions, served a political purpose beyond its operational rationale. The decision was both operationally defensible and politically motivated. Eisenhower's memoir acknowledges only one of those dimensions. Montgomery's conduct of the Northern battle during the critical period from December 20th to January 3rd is the most persistently contested command question of the entire Ardennes campaign. And I want to be precise about what the records actually show, rather than what the national legend, on either the British or American side, prefers. Montgomery arrived at 1st Army headquarters on December 20th and, by most accounts, imposed order on a genuinely disordered situation. He reorganized the northern defenses competently. He identified the Meuse River line as the essential boundary the Germans must not cross, and then he paused, deliberately, before counterattacking. A pause that lasted until January 3rd. His chief of staff, Major General Francis de Guingamp, defended this pause in his memoirs as tactically necessary. The American units needed time to consolidate, the German offensive needed time to culminate, and attacking prematurely risked local defeat that could unravel the entire northern defense. These are serious arguments made by serious men. The counter-argument, pressed most forcefully by American Corps commanders operating under Montgomery's command during this period, is equally serious. General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, believed that the German formations in the northern salient, including the SS armored spearheads that had driven furthest west, were in a state of culmination by December 24th. They were out of fuel, stretched beyond their supply lines, and vulnerable to aggressive counterattack in a way they would not be after another week of defensive consolidation. Collins wanted to attack on December 26th. He was told to wait. Eisenhower's cable to Montgomery on January 7, 1945, a document that came close to producing an outright command rupture and was withheld from publication for years, states in plain terms that the delay in the northern counterattack has permitted the enemy to withdraw forces that should have been captured. This was Eisenhower's private assessment, the opposite of his public posture during the same period. The gap between those two positions is not a minor administrative discrepancy. While the command argument was running its course at Army group and theater level, Patton was fighting. This is, when examined closely, the most structurally significant operational fact of the entire battle. The strategic debate about where to attack and with what was happening simultaneously with, and entirely separately from, the actual combat operations being conducted by the Third Army. Patton had been given his axis, Arlon to Bastogne, and his objective, relieve the 101st. And he was executing it with every available resource, while his superiors argued about priorities he had no power to influence. When he needed additional forces to expand the Bastogne perimeter after December 26th, he was told none were available, partly because supply priority was being directed north to support the eventual Montgomery counterattack. The Third Army was doing the immediate, visible, necessary work of the battle on a resource allocation that reflected its secondary status in the command hierarchy. Patton's diary from this period is controlled, but the control is visibly effortful. It fascinates me, reading the Bradley and Patton diaries from the same days in parallel, how differently these two men processed institutional frustration. Bradley, who had lost his armies to Montgomery, goes quiet in the record. His diary entries become shorter, more guarded, less operationally specific. He is a man processing an injury in private. Patton, whose preferred strategic option, the base-cutting thrust, had been rejected in favor of Bradley's more conservative Bastogne priority, goes in the opposite direction. More operational detail, more command visits, more specific tactical direction. Where Bradley withdrew, Patton accelerated. This isn't a moral judgment. It's an observation about how two different personalities responded to the same kind of constraint. What the records suggest is that Bradley's withdrawal from active management in the aftermath of the Montgomery decision created a command vacuum that Patton, operating below him, instinctively and correctly filled. Patton's relationship with Bradley during this period is one of the more nuanced command partnerships in the record of the Western Campaign. They were not friends in the personal sense. They had profound operational disagreements about objectives, about method, about the appropriate aggressiveness of the campaign. But they were professionals, and the professional record shows a working relationship that neither man's post-war memoir fully captures. When Bradley told Patton on December 20th that Bastogne was the objective rather than the base of the salient, Patton accepted it and executed it. When Bradley provided additional truck companies from the 12th Army Group pool to help the 3rd Army logistics reorientation, Patton's staff used them efficiently and acknowledged the support. The public mythology of Patton as a lone genius straining against inadequate superiors misses this. He operated within a command structure, accepted decisions he disagreed with, and made those decisions work. That is not a lesser achievement than the more dramatic version. The specific operational cost of the Montgomery decision, the Northern counterattack delayed from roughly December 26th to January 3rd, is most clearly visible in what the German records show happening during that window. Army Group B's operations log for the last days of December records the methodical withdrawal of German formations from the northern and central portions of the salient. Units pulling back, fuel being consolidated, damaged vehicles recovered, command posts relocated eastward. The German armies that had attacked were not destroyed in the salient. They were allowed to contract, reorganize, and establish new defensive positions closer to Germany. They would fight again on the Rhine, and again after that. The soldiers who would eventually have to break those positions were already in the field in December 1944, not yet knowing what was being preserved for them. The Allied command structure in December 1944 was a coalition of genuine allies with genuine disagreements about strategy, method, and national interest, functioning under the extraordinary pressure of an unexpected crisis. It produced results. The German offensive was defeated, Bastogne was relieved, the front was stabilized, that validate its basic functionality. What it did not produce was the maximum possible strategic outcome. These two things are true simultaneously, and the honest historical assessment has to hold both of them. The men who made the decisions were operating under conditions of genuine uncertainty, genuine time pressure, and genuine political constraint. They made choices that were defensible. Some of those choices had costs that showed up later, in a different theater, at a different cost. The archive records both the achievement and the cost. The monument records only the achievement. A documentary that aspires to honesty has to do better than the monument. By the 28th of December, Patton wrote in his diary, "The First Army is doing nothing. Monty will not attack. I am holding the whole front." In the margin, in the same ink, and apparently written at the same time, he added a single word: Ike. What that word means, whether it is accusation, frustration, solidarity, or something more complex, is not stated. Patton was not, in the end, a man who needed to explain himself to his own diary. But the word sits there in the margin, one syllable carrying everything he had decided not to say out loud, in a document that would remain sealed until long after everyone involved was dead. Chapter 8. Cobra King, The Final Drive. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the 26th of December, 1944. The village of Clochimont, Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stands beside his tank, the 5th tank he has commanded in this war, named Thunderbolt in the running series of vehicles he has used up in the process of getting here. And he is looking north at a road map. The village of Assenois is 2.5 kilometers away. Bastogne is 5 kilometers past that. He has 9 operational tanks in C Company and a column of armored infantry behind them. He has, as he later told Army historians, about an hour of daylight left. He tells his artillery liaison to get the heaviest concentration available onto Assenois in the next 10 minutes. Then he calls for Lieutenant Charles Bogus. The decision to use the Assenois route for the final breakthrough is one of the most significant tactical choices of the entire relief operation, and it receives remarkably little analytical attention in the popular accounts, which tend to jump straight to the dramatic moment of contact at the perimeter. Abrams had been studying the approaches to Bastogne for days, physically moving through the terrain, reading the ground the way experienced armor commanders learn to read it, noting which roads had adequate load-bearing capacity for fully laden Shermans, which tree lines could conceal anti-tank guns, which villages sat at angles that would allow German gunners to engage his column from the flank. The other available routes had been tried and found costly. The Assenois road was shorter, more direct, and accordingly more heavily defended at specific points. Abrams's calculation was that artillery could suppress those points long enough for the column to push through at speed. The calculation assumed his artillery could be accurate enough and fast enough to neutralize German anti-tank crews in the seconds between the barrage lifting and the lead tank arriving. It was a tight margin. He took it. The specific vehicle that Abrams assigned to lead the column is worth describing in detail because it wasn't chosen arbitrarily. The M4A3E2, the designation for what crews called the Jumbo Sherman, was an assault variant produced in limited numbers, with 6 inches of armor on the turret face and 4 inches on the hull, achieved through a combination of thickened base armor and welded applique plates added at the factory. Only 254 Jumbos were produced in total. The vehicle carried a 75mm gun rather than the more powerful 76mm version fitted to standard late-model Shermans, a deliberate choice that prioritized the interior space and reliability of the older armament over anti-tank penetration, because the Jumbo was designed for assault on fortifications rather than for tank versus tank engagements at long range. The specific vehicle assigned to Bogus, named Cobra King, weighed approximately 38 tons and was powered by a Ford GAA V8 engine producing 500 horsepower, enough to sustain roughly 22 miles per hour on hard road at combat weight. At that speed, transiting through a village the size of Assinois took approximately 12 seconds. Bogus's own written account of the final approach, preserved in the 37th Tank Battalion's unit history, describes what happened in the kind of compressed, after-the-fact clarity that combat veterans often achieve only in retrospect. The column moved at full speed with all weapons firing, the tanks spraying cannon and machine gun fire to both sides of the road, the armored infantry half-tracks behind them adding their own fire to the flanks. The American artillery barrage was landing simultaneously in and around the village as the column moved through it. This was deliberate. Abrams had calculated that the suppressive effect of the artillery was most valuable in the seconds the column was actually transiting the kill zones, and that the risk of short rounds landing among his own vehicles was acceptable given the alternative, a column moving through a prepared defensive position under accurate, unrestricted fire. Some of those rounds did land short. They stopped half of the column. Half-tracks behind the first wave of tanks halted. A gap opened in the formation. Here is the moment that the official records do not quite capture in its human specificity. With the column divided, Bogus and 3 tanks clear through Assinois on the north side, the remainder of the column stalled on the south side. German soldiers sprinted onto the road in the gap and laid mines. The stalled portion of the column was pinned. Bogus had no communication with the vehicles behind him, no knowledge of whether they would clear the gap and follow, and no way of knowing how many German troops were between him and the Bastogne perimeter. He had 3 tanks. He looked at the road ahead. He kept going. This decision, to continue north with 3 tanks rather than halt and wait for the column to reform, was not in any order he had received. It was a judgment call made in real time by a lieutenant who understood, at that specific moment, that stopping guaranteed failure and moving forward offered a chance. That is the decision on which the relief of Bastogne turned. The approach to the 101st perimeter, as Bogus described it, was not the triumphal charge that the mythology suggests. The tanks slowed. The foxholes appeared out of the late afternoon gray, barely visible in the failing light. Machine guns were leveled at Cobra King from multiple positions simultaneously. Bogus stood up in the commander's hatch, the hatch open, his torso exposed above the turret, and shouted into the darkness, "Come on out! This is the 4th Armored Division!" Nothing moved. He shouted again. Then again. First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion finally climbed from his foxhole and walked toward the tank. He reached up a hand. Bogus shook it. The time was 1650 hours on December 26, 1944. The siege of Bastogne was over. I want to note something about Webster that most accounts handle briefly and then pass over. He was not a combat infantryman. He was a combat engineer, a specialist in construction, demolition, and obstacle clearing, who had been pressed into service as a perimeter rifleman because the 101st Airborne didn't have enough infantry to hold its entire defensive line. The first soldier to come out of the foxhole and greet Patton's tanks was a man doing a job he wasn't trained for, in a position he wasn't supposed to occupy, because the siege had consumed so many men that every specialist had become a rifleman by December 26th. That detail, unremarked in most accounts, says something about the nature of what had been endured inside the perimeter that no statistical summary of casualties quite achieves. When I was cross-referencing the time logs between the 4th Armored Division's records and the 101st Airborne's G3 log, I found the 5-minute discrepancy that has generated sustained post-war argument among veterans associations. The 4th Armored logs the breakthrough at 16:45. The 101st logs first contact at 16:50. 5 minutes. Both documents are contemporaneous. Neither unit was being dishonest. They were recording the same event from different positions on a battlefield where field watches were not synchronized and the light was failing. The 5-minute gap is not a historical mystery. It is a description of what primary sources actually are. Records made by human beings with imperfect instruments under imperfect conditions. The argument about which unit's timestamp is correct has lasted 80 years. Both timestamps are probably correct, for the person who wrote them. The first supply convoy to push through the Bastogne corridor arrived under German fire the night of December 26th into December 27th. 40 tons of medical supplies, 50 tons of artillery ammunition, 15 tons of rations. Numbers that look modest until you understand what they meant to men who had been on rationed ammunition and reduced rations for a week. The 101st's artillerymen, who had been firing 10 rounds per gun per day, had enough ammunition by the morning of the 27th to respond to German attacks at something approaching normal combat rates. The 652 wounded men evacuated in the return trip, carried south in empty supply trucks through a corridor that was already being attacked by German forces trying to re-establish the encirclement, left Bastogne in vehicles that had arrived less than 12 hours earlier. The corridor was 1 vehicle wide. It was under fire the whole way. Every truck that made the trip was a decision somebody made in the dark about whether to go. The relief of Bastogne at 16:50 hours on December 26, 1944, is the event. The 9 days of fighting that followed to make that relief permanent are the part of the story that the event tends to obscure. The corridor would be cut and reopened multiple times in the following week. German forces would mount a serious counteroffensive from the northwest beginning December 30th, using fresh armored formations that had not been committed to the initial offensive. The 4th Armored Division, which had arrived at the perimeter with approximately half its original tank strength, would spend the next 10 days defending a position it had been designed to attack through. None of this diminishes what happened at 1650. But it situates it accurately in a campaign that was not finished when Cobra King's tracks stopped moving in the snow outside the 101st's foxholes. The handshake between Boggess and Webster was real, complete, and historically decisive. It was also not the end. Chapter 9. What the Perimeter Cost. The medical log of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, December 21st, 1944. A handwritten notation. No more morphine. Below it, a patient name, a wound description. 3 days later, the same notation appears in the same log, in a different hand. Then again on December 24th. 3 entries, 3 separate authors, the same 4 words each time. Not a request, not a complaint, a record, entered in the same flat administrative tone as the entries before and after it. The log doesn't editorialize. It simply records that the morphine ran out and notes who was there when it did. Those 4 words, written 3 times in 5 days by 3 different medics, contain more of the truth of the Bastogne siege than most accounts of the battle manage across entire chapters. Captain Jack Pryor, regimental surgeon of the 502nd Parachute Infantry, had set up his aid station in a Belgian farmhouse somewhere on the western edge of the perimeter. He had no X-ray capability, no proper operating theater. Supply lines to the interior of the perimeter were functioning, imperfectly, through what vehicles could be moved under fire between positions. By December 21st, he had been awake for most of 48 hours, and his supply inventory was becoming a daily exercise in calculating which procedures were still possible and which were not. He later testified that he performed amputations without general anesthesia because ether reserves were exhausted. He did not describe this as remarkable. He described it as what was available. The medical record of the Bastogne siege is, in this specific way, consistent throughout. It has the tone of people doing their jobs under conditions that have simply changed the definition of what the job requires. The cold is the detail that most accounts mention once and then move past. But the 101st Airborne's own medical report insists on its operational significance in a way that deserves full attention. Temperatures during the siege averaged approximately 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills recorded in some positions as low as -20 degrees. The division had arrived from Reims in standard winter clothing, wool uniforms, standard boots, regulation equipment, without the overshoes, white camouflage smocks, and supplementary insulation that sustained cold weather operations required. The non-battle casualty figures tell the story with more precision than any description. Approximately 22% of the 101st's total casualties during the siege were cold injuries, trench foot, frostbite, hypothermia, not wounds from enemy action, the cold. By the calculation of the division's own medical staff, roughly 1 in 5 of the men who became non-operational during the siege of Bastogne were incapacitated by the weather rather than by the enemy. Treating trench foot in a fighting position in December 1944 presented a specific medical paradox that the unit histories tend to describe briefly and then pass over. The standard treatment, gradual rewarming, rest, elevation, required conditions that did not exist in a defensive perimeter under intermittent German attack. A soldier with early-stage trench foot could not be removed from his foxhole without reducing the strength of the position he was defending. If he stayed in the foxhole, his condition worsened. If he was evacuated to a heated building, he risked the paradoxical temperature shock that rapid rewarming in severe cases can produce. The medic's practical toolkit was essentially limited to dry socks, sourced, in many cases, from the dead, and whatever improvised insulation could be assembled from available materials. The men who held the Bastogne perimeter for 7 days were, by December 26th, physically degraded in measurable ways that no official document states plainly. Lighter, colder, less mobile, less alert than they had been on December 19th. They held the perimeter anyway. Here is the specific weight of the siege in numbers, because numbers are the only honest way to state it. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units suffered approximately 3,020 total casualties between December 19th and December 26th, killed, wounded, and missing. Of these, roughly 660 were non-battle casualties, the cold injuries and illnesses that the official records sometimes list separately and sometimes fold into the overall casualty total, depending on how the reporting officer understood the distinction. The division's medical staff had, before the siege, predicted that cold weather injuries would be significant if adequate gear wasn't distributed. That prediction was made. The gear wasn't distributed. The prediction proved accurate. 3,020 total casualties in 7 days of defensive fighting, for a formation that arrived at Bastogne with approximately 15,000 men, represents a casualty rate of roughly 20%. In the language of military operations, a formation that absorbs 20% casualties in 7 days is still combat effective. It is not the same formation it was when those 7 days started. The German bombardment on Christmas Eve, December 24th, is recorded in both American military documents and Belgian municipal records, and the two records don't entirely agree on what it achieved. McAuliffe's after-action report describes the bombardment as targeted primarily at the road network within the perimeter, an attempt to disrupt supply distribution rather than to destroy fighting positions. The captured German artillery targeting records for the same period show the primary designated targets were identified American command posts, not road junctions. Both things may be true. German gunners aimed at command posts. Their shells fell across the town, and the road network was disrupted as a secondary effect. What neither American nor German document adequately records is the civilian dimension. The Belgian Municipal Death Register for December 1944 carries at least 11 names of residents killed on Christmas Eve. 11 people, named in the municipal register of a small Belgian market town, who died in a building that appears in no military document on either side. The military archive is silent about them. The town's own records are not. It fascinates me, as a researcher, how consistently the Belgian civilian experience of the Bastogne siege disappears from English-language accounts. The civilian population that remained in the town, an estimated 4,000 people who had not evacuated when they had the chance, provided specific material support to the American garrison. Cellars for wounded men, local geographic knowledge for patrol routes, information about German positions observed from civilian vantage points that soldiers in foxholes couldn't access. This contribution is acknowledged in scattered American unit histories and almost entirely absent from the official after-action reports. The history of Bastogne, as written primarily from American military sources, is the history of what the Americans did. The people who lived there before the Americans arrived and would live there after they left are mostly off-stage. The supply airdrop that began on December 23rd transformed the arithmetic of the siege without ending the siege. 241 C-47 sorties in the first 2 days delivered, among other things, enough 75mm ammunition to quadruple the 101st's effective artillery striking capacity. The 105th Glider Field Artillery, which had been firing at 10 rounds per gun per day, could now respond to German attacks at something closer to sustainable combat rates. This mattered tactically in a direct and immediate way. German assaults on the perimeter on December 23rd and 24th encountered a heavier defensive artillery response than any attack since the siege began, and several were stopped at their assembly areas by pre-planned fires that the supply drop had made possible. The mathematics of the siege shifted. Not all the way. The perimeter was still surrounded, the corridor still unopened, the wounded still accumulating in the farmhouse aid stations. But the trajectory changed. Private John Ballard of the 506th Parachute Infantry began a letter home to his mother in Wheeling, West Virginia on December 21st. He wrote 3 pages that day. The letter then sits incomplete until December 26th, when a 4th page was added. The handwriting on the 4th page is different from the first 3. Looser, slightly less controlled, the pen pressure uneven. The 4th page begins with 2 words. Still here. The letter continues for another short paragraph and then ends. It was mailed sometime after December 26th. It arrived. Ballard survived the siege. The letter is in the collection of the 101st Airborne Division Museum at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which is where I found a transcription of it referenced in a curator's annotation. The 2 words that begin the 4th page are, to me, the most honest summary of the Bastogne defense available in any primary source. Not inspiration, not defiance, just the specific, private relief of a man writing to his mother to confirm that he is still alive. The 652 wounded men evacuated through the Assinois corridor on the night of December 26th were moved in empty supply trucks on the return trip south. The corridor was active with German fire during the movement. The trucks were unarmored. The drivers had no choice about the route and no guarantee of arriving at the other end. Every man who was carried out that night, bandaged, immobilized, incapable of doing anything about the conditions of his own evacuation, was placed in the back of a vehicle by a medic who was making a judgment call about whether the journey's risk was preferable to remaining in a farmhouse aid station behind German lines. All 652 made it through. This fact appears in a single line of the logistics summary. It deserves more than a single line. Chapter 10. The German View from the Ring. The 21st of December, 1944. Somewhere in the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division's command area, south and east of Bastogne, a staff officer writes an entry in the divisional war diary. The language is standard Wehrmacht format, compressed and precise. The American position at Bastogne remains untenably strong for the forces assigned. The entry then requests either additional heavy artillery or authorization to bypass the town entirely. The entry closes with a notation that should have been alarming to anyone reading it up the command chain. No reply received. The absence of reply is the document's most significant detail. The German command above division level had no good answer, because it had no additional resources to send and would not authorize a bypass that the road network made operationally necessary. The entry sits in the record as evidence of a command system that had set an impossible task and then gone silent when its impossibility was formally reported. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel is one of the war's more interesting senior commanders, and his post-war testimony, given extensively to U.S. Army historical teams in the years following the war, is unusually frank for a defeated senior officer. He was not, by the available evidence, a Nazi ideologue in any operationally meaningful sense. He was a professional soldier of considerable skill who had made his reputation on the Eastern Front in defensive operations of remarkable competence. His 5th Panzer Army's performance in the Ardennes offensive was, at the tactical and operational level, better than Sepp Dietrich's more heavily resourced 6th SS Panzer Army in the north. Von Manteuffel's columns penetrated further, moved faster, and came closer to the Meuse than the SS formations that had received priority of equipment and fuel. In his post-war testimony, he identified clearly and without apparent resentment the two decisions that made his offensive fail: the fuel allocation shortfall he had documented before the operation began, and the inability to either capture or bypass Bastogne in the first 3 days. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, that bore primary responsibility for reducing Bastogne, is a formation whose quality is frequently misrepresented in English-language accounts, which tend to describe it either as an elite assault division or as a broken collection of barely trained reserves, depending on what the narrative needs it to be at any given moment. The truth is more specific. The division had entered the offensive with approximately 17,000 men, organized into 3 infantry regiments of 2 battalions each, a reduced structure compared to the pre-war German infantry division's 9-battalion organization. Its personnel included a significant proportion of non-infantry specialists transferred from Luftwaffe ground units as the air war increasingly grounded German aviation, giving the Wehrmacht a surplus of mechanics and a deficit of frontline infantry. Its heavy weapons, specifically anti-tank guns and artillery pieces, were present in reduced numbers compared to 1941 or 1942 German divisional standards. By the division's own assessment, included in captured German records, its effective combat power was equivalent to perhaps 60% of a full-strength infantry division. Against dug-in American paratroopers with artillery support, 60% of a full-strength infantry division was not enough. The specific tactical problem the 26th Volksgrenadier faced at Bastogne is worth examining in its technical detail, because the division's repeated failure to penetrate the perimeter is often attributed to American fighting quality alone, when the geometry of the situation was at least equally important. The Bastogne perimeter in December 1944 was roughly circular, approximately 5 miles in diameter, anchored on the villages and road junctions controlling approaches to the town center. This geometry meant that any German assault force attacking across the open fields surrounding the perimeter was exposed to observed artillery fire from the moment it crossed the tree line until the moment it reached the American foxholes, a distance of anywhere from 500 to 800 meters of open ground, depending on the sector. The 101st Artillery officers had pre-computed firing data for every likely approach route before the siege began, meaning that a single radio call from a forward observer could produce accurate fire without the adjustment rounds that would consume scarce ammunition. German assault formations had to cross those fields under fire that began landing on them before they reached effective range of their own weapons. This is not a description of incompetent German attackers. It is a description of terrain and geometry working against the offense. The surrender demand of December 22nd, the typed ultimatum in both German and English, delivered under a white flag by 4 German officers, is so well known in its result that its origin tends to get compressed. The decision to send it was made not by Hitler's headquarters or by Army Group B, but by General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, who believed that a formal demand might produce a quick capitulation and spare both sides the cost of a direct assault. The demand was typed on standard Wehrmacht field headquarters equipment, carefully worded and delivered through proper channels. McAuliffe's first response on reading it, nuts, was apparently so immediate and unconsidered that his staff had to persuade him that this was, in fact, a complete diplomatic reply. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard, his aide, suggested writing it formally. McAuliffe wrote, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The document was handed back to the German officers who had delivered the original demand. They returned to von Lüttwitz. The translation into German rendered nuts as a word closer in meaning to absurd, a translation that strips out the contemptuous vernacular entirely and replaces it with something more formal and considered. The German recipients processed the reply as a curt refusal. What they missed was the specific American register of the word, the tone of a man waving away in irritation rather than responding to a serious proposition. Here is where the German and American intelligence assessments diverge in a way that had direct operational consequences. The 47th Corps' intelligence summary for December 25, 1944, assessed the approaching 4th Armored Division Relief Force as likely to penetrate within 24 to 48 hours. This summary, written at corps level by officers with access to frontline observation reports and prisoner interrogations, was reasonably accurate. The relief occurred approximately 24 hours after it was written. The Army Group B intelligence summary for the same date, written at a higher level with access to a broader but less granular picture, assessed the relief as unlikely to reach Bastogne before December 28th. This summary was 3 days wrong. The Army Group B summary, not the Corps summary, was the document transmitted to Hitler's headquarters. The decisions made on the basis of the Army Group B assessment, specifically, the decision to continue the westward drive toward the Meuse rather than concentrate available reserves to sever the approaching relief corridor, were made on information that was significantly less accurate than the information available 2 levels lower in the command chain. The better intelligence was further from the decision-makers. The worse intelligence was the one that determined what happened next. When I was reading von Manteuffel's 1945 testimony alongside the 5th Panzer Army operations log, I was struck by his description of what he calls the simultaneous demand, the requirement his army faced of both advancing west toward the Meuse and containing the Bastogne fortress with the same forces. He describes asking repeatedly for additional formations to perform one task or the other and receiving, in his phrasing, encouragement rather than resources. The higher command wanted both objectives pursued simultaneously and provided the means for neither with adequate force. Von Manteuffel's professional frustration at this situation comes through clearly in the testimony, and I find his account more credible than the higher command's retrospective claims that adequate resources were made available. The divisional war diaries of the units actually conducting the siege, the 26th Volksgrenadier, the various Panzergrenadier elements screening the western approaches, consistently describe shortages of artillery ammunition, fuel, and infantry replacements that the Army Group B records don't acknowledge. By December 24th, German intelligence at multiple levels had confirmed that the 4th Armored Division was within striking distance of the Bastogne perimeter. The available German reserves in the area consisted of elements of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division and the Führer-Begleit Brigade. Formations of reasonable quality, but insufficient strength to both block the American relief column and maintain the siege simultaneously. The decision about how to allocate these reserves was, in retrospect, the last meaningful German operational decision of the Bastogne battle. Von Lüttwitz committed them to severing the American corridor after the breakthrough, rather than blocking the approach beforehand. He may not have had a better option, given the resources available. The breakthrough happened anyway. The corridor was cut twice in the following days, and reopened twice. The third time the Americans pushed a convoy through, it stayed open. The German failure at Bastogne was not primarily a failure of courage or tactical skill. The Fallschirmjäger battalions defending the approach roads south of the perimeter fought tenaciously enough to delay a quality American armored division for 4 days. The Volksgrenadiers, who repeatedly assaulted the 101st's perimeter, took casualties that would have been operationally fatal for most formations and kept attacking. What failed was the system above them, the plan that assigned incompatible tasks to the same forces, the logistics that allocated fuel for half the distance the plan required, the intelligence that reached the decision-makers 3 days late. The soldiers in the ring around Bastogne were asked to accomplish something the system around them had made impossible before they began. The archive shows this clearly. The monument doesn't mention it. Chapter 11. Patton's Logistics Machine. The Third Army G4 Daily Supply Summary for December 22, 1944 is a 3-page mimeographed document with handwritten margin corrections in at least 2 different colors of ink. 47 separate line items. Artillery ammunition forward. Fuel distribution by corps area. Medical supply status. Bridge building materials. Signal wire. And, on the second page, a single line that stops me every time I read it. Map distribution complete. 57 tons delivered to forward units. 57 tons of maps. Not a weapon, not a round of ammunition, not a gallon of fuel. Maps. Because the Third Army was pivoting into terrain none of its units had operated in, and without accurate maps, the advance would navigate by memory and guesswork through a Belgian forest in December. The 57 tons of maps appears as a line item sandwiched between artillery shell fuse allocations and fuel pump repair kits. Nobody wrote a commendation for the people who moved 57 tons of paper across icy roads in the dark. They just moved it. Brigadier General Walter J. Muller, the Third Army's G4, its logistics commander, is among the most consequential and least celebrated figures in the entire Bastogne operation. His name does not appear in the film. It appears in a handful of footnotes in the academic literature. He had, between December 18th and December 23rd, 1944, supervised a logistics operation of extraordinary complexity that made everything else in this story possible. And he supervised it, without drama, without public acknowledgement, and without the luxury of knowing whether the tactical situation his logistics were supporting would succeed or fail. Good logistics officers work this way. The supply chain doesn't know if the battle is going well. It just keeps moving. The specific magnitude of what Muller's staff accomplished between December 18th and 23rd is most clearly conveyed through the aggregate figure that appears in the Third Army's own post-war assessment. 63,000 tons of supplies moved in 5 days. To put this in the context of what normal operations looked like, the Third Army's standard daily supply throughput during the Saar campaign had been in the range of 6,000 to 7,000 tons per day. The logistics reorientation required sustaining almost double the normal daily throughput on a new axis, with a partially reconstructed infrastructure. This meant, simultaneously, closing depot sites near the Saar front, opening new forward installations along the roads running north through Luxembourg and into Belgium, redirecting the truck companies hauling supplies so their entire route structure changed overnight, establishing new artillery positions along an axis that hadn't existed in the Third Army's planning documents a week earlier, and doing all of it while the combat divisions themselves were also using those same roads to move north. The supply trucks and the tank columns were sharing icy roads in the dark, traveling in opposite directions, on a schedule that required constant manual management because the roads couldn't handle both simultaneously without coordination. The transportation problem was solved, partially, by a request that illustrates how coalition logistics actually works in practice. Muller's organic truck companies were insufficient to support both troop movement and supply movement at the required rates simultaneously. The math simply didn't work with the vehicles available. He requested additional truck companies from the 12th Army Group pool. Bradley's staff, despite everything Bradley was managing simultaneously, the Montgomery decision, the command reorganization, his own suppressed fury at the institutional situation, provided approximately 40 additional companies with a combined capacity of roughly 2,000 short tons per lift. These vehicles ran around the clock over 5 days, their drivers navigating roads they had never driven, using maps that had arrived 57 tons at a time. The system worked because multiple components worked together, and each component was managed by someone whose name appears in no popular account of the battle. The communications infrastructure requirement was, in its own way, as demanding as the supply movement. Patton's command style depended on direct telephone communication. He preferred to speak to corps and division commanders personally rather than through written orders, believing that tone and emphasis conveyed through a telephone call carried information that paper didn't. To sustain this style over a reoriented front required a new field communications network across the entire north-south axis of the Third Army's new operational area. The Signal Corps estimate for this network was 20,000 miles of telephone wire, physically strung across fields, over roads, and through villages by linemen working in near-blizzard conditions, wearing gloves that made fine motor work difficult, on ladders and poles that ice had made treacherous. 20,000 miles of wire. The Third Army's Signal After Action Report claims the major communication nodes were connected by December 22nd, in time for the Third Corps jump-off. Patton's diary for the same day mentions communications problems with Milliken's headquarters. Both documents are probably accurate, in the way that a network can technically exist and still be unreliable. The wire was there, it was just working imperfectly, which is different from not working at all. When I was working through the artillery preparation records for the December 22nd 3rd Corps jump-off, the figure that kept demanding attention was the 108 battalions of Corps and Army artillery that Patton describes in his diary. 1,296 guns of 105 millimeters or larger. The individual 105 millimeter M2 howitzer, the most common piece in this collection, weighed approximately 2.5 tons in its standard towed configuration, and consumed approximately 42 pounds of materiel, projectile, propellant charge, and fuse, for each round fired. Sustaining 1,296 of these weapons at combat rates required approximately 4,500 tons of ammunition per day, delivered forward on roads simultaneously carrying combat units, returning empties, and medical evacuation convoys. The fact that those guns were in position and supplied on December 22nd is not a given. It is an achievement. It is the direct result of Mueller's staff having spent 4 days doing the kind of work that doesn't produce cinematic moments. The ammunition supply chain for the Third Corps attack runs through one of the clearest examples of Mueller's approach to the logistics problem. Rather than waiting for the road network to be fully cleared and the depot system fully established before beginning forward delivery, his staff ran a continuous rolling resupply, trucks delivering to the furthest accessible point, transferring loads to smaller vehicles for the final legs, and returning immediately to reload. This approach, essentially a sustained conveyor belt rather than a point-to-point delivery system, kept the artillery supplied even during periods when individual road segments were blocked by German action, blown bridges, or vehicle breakdowns. It was less efficient than a clean depot-to-gun line delivery. It was more resilient. The distinction between efficiency and resilience in military logistics is one of the things the Bastogne operation teaches most clearly. A perfectly efficient system fails completely when a single element breaks. A resilient system degrades partially and continues functioning. The geographic accident that helped Mueller's operation more than any planning decision is one of those details that only emerges when you look at the supply map alongside the operational map simultaneously. Patton's Saar offensive had required large ammunition stockpiles positioned near Metz and Thionville, both cities on the western side of his army's previous axis of advance. When the pivot north began and the Third Army's axis rotated 90 degrees, those same stockpiles were now behind the new advance rather than ahead of the old one. The logistics infrastructure built to support an eastward attack toward Frankfurt was, by the geometric accident of the pivot, positioned almost perfectly to support a northward attack toward Bastogne. The ammunition that had been pre-positioned for a battle that never happened fed the battle that did. Mueller and his staff did not plan this. Geography provided it. But recognizing the opportunity and exploiting it immediately, redirecting the depot system rather than waiting to build new ones, required the kind of quick operational logistics thinking that Mueller's team had apparently internalized. The human cost of sustaining the Third Army's logistics operation during these 5 days is essentially invisible in the official record. Truck drivers working 18 to 20-hour shifts on roads where a wrong turn or a moment of inattention could send a loaded vehicle into a ditch or off a bridge. Signal Corps linemen stringing wire in temperatures that made the work both physically painful and technically exacting. Depot workers sorting, loading, and distributing supplies under time pressure that left no margin for error. The official records mention these activities in aggregate: 63,000 tons, 20,000 miles of wire, 57 tons of maps, without acknowledging that each of those aggregate figures is composed of specific individual acts performed by specific individual people, most of whose names appear nowhere in the historical record. The machine worked because people worked. The people worked in the dark and the cold and with incomplete information, the way people have always worked in logistics, which is to say, without anyone watching. Chapter 12. The Men Inside the Perimeter. A Week of Letters. The 21st of December, 1944. A Belgian farmhouse somewhere on the 506th Parachute Infantry sector of the Bastogne perimeter. Private John Ballard sits with his back against a wall and a piece of paper on his knee. The farmhouse is not warm exactly. It is less cold than outside, which passes for warmth by December standards inside a Belgian perimeter under siege. He writes 3 pages to his mother in Wheeling, West Virginia. He tells her what he can tell her under the censorship rules, which is to say, not much. He tells her he is well. He tells her he is thinking of her. He does not tell her about the ammunition rationing, or the dead in the next position, or the medical log down the road with its 3 entries of "no more morphine." He folds the letter into his jacket because there is nowhere to mail it from. 5 days later, on December 26th, he adds a 4th page. The handwriting is different. The pen pressure uneven, the letters slightly less controlled. 2 words begin the page. Still here. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment is the unit that later became familiar to a large part of the world through the television series based on Stephen Ambrose's oral history. And that familiarity carries both a gift and a complication. The gift is that the human texture of this specific regiment's experience at Bastogne has been documented and dramatized with unusual care. The complication is that the dramatization, however responsible, is still a narrative selection, a compression of specific events, a focus on specific individuals, a smoothing of the weeks and months of complexity into a story that can be told in a specific number of hours. The letters and diaries that survive from inside the perimeter are less smooth. They are fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, sometimes simply mundane in the way that life under siege is mostly mundane and occasionally terrifying. Reading them, what you get is not the drama, you get the texture. Sergeant Donald Nichols, also of the 506th, led a night patrol into the German lines on the night of December 22nd or 23rd. His own letter home is imprecise about the exact date, which is itself a small, honest indicator of what those days were like. The patrol's purpose was intelligence, specifically to identify German artillery positions whose fire had been systematically hitting the perimeter's western sector. Nichols wrote about the patrol the following day. You get used to walking in the dark if the alternative is not walking at all. The patrol identified 2 German 150mm howitzer positions. That information was passed to the artillery officers managing the newly delivered airdrop ammunition. The guns were engaged by American artillery, using those positions as targets. Whether the engagement was successful isn't documented in the same chain of records that preserves the patrol report and the letter. But the connection between a patrol in the dark and the targeting of an artillery battery is exactly the kind of granular intelligence-to-action link that keeps a perimeter functional when everything else is running on minimum margins. The artillery rationing policy, 10 rounds per gun per day across approximately 60 howitzers of various calibers, requires a specific kind of imaginative reconstruction to understand as it was actually experienced by the men implementing it. An artillery forward observer with the 101st in December 1944 would have been trained in a fire support system designed for a different scale of consumption. He would have learned to call for fire with a certain freedom. Adjust, adjust, fire for effect, built around the assumption that the ammunition would be there when he needed it. Now the assumption was reversed. Every call for fire was a consumption decision. Every adjustment round was a deliberate expenditure weighed against all the other calls that might come later that day. The forward observers who managed this rationing did so in positions that were themselves under fire, making conservation decisions in the same moment they were making survival decisions. There is no official document that captures what this felt like. The personal accounts capture fragments of it. The overall picture has to be reconstructed from those fragments. The Christmas Eve bombardment of December 24th deserves attention not primarily for its military dimensions, but for what the Belgian municipal records reveal that the military records do not. McAuliffe's after-action report notes some civilian casualties and moves on. The Bastogne municipal death register for December 1944 is more specific. At minimum, 11 civilian names, registered with dates of death on December 24th. 11 people who were not soldiers. 11 people who lived in the town before the paratroopers arrived and who were still there when the German artillery fell on Christmas Eve because they had nowhere else to go, or because they had decided their homes were their homes, regardless of what armies were fighting over them, or because they were too old or too sick to move. Their names are in the register. Their names are in no American military document. I note this not as an accusation, but because the gap between what the military record preserves and what the town's own records preserve is itself a kind of truth about how wars are documented and who gets to be in the official account. The 101st Airborne's internal coherence during the siege is sometimes presented as unbroken. The famous esprit de corps of the airborne holding steady through 7 days of encirclement. The actual after-action report, which is institutionally motivated to present the division favorably, is more honest than the mythology. It acknowledges temporary withdrawals from assigned positions in several sectors on December 20th and 21st under pressure from German assaults that temporarily overwhelmed company-level defensive positions. These withdrawals were restored, in most cases within hours. The perimeter never broke, but it bent. Men in foxholes in sub-zero temperatures who have been without adequate food for 36 hours and without adequate ammunition for their supporting artillery sometimes leave their positions when a German assault comes in. They came back. This matters. But so does the fact that they left. A history that omits the leaving in favor of the returning is telling half a story. When I was cross-referencing the 101st's regimental sector reports with the German 26th Volksgrenadiers assault records for December 21st and 22nd, I found a specific instance where the two documents describe the same engagement from opposite sides, and the comparison is instructive. The American sector report describes temporary displacement in a specific subsection of the perimeter. The German regimental war diary for the same date and sector describes initial penetration followed by American counterattack restoring the line. Both documents are accurate accounts of the same 2 hours. The American document uses the language of orderly adjustment. The German document uses the language of a fight that went both ways. Neither is dishonest. Together, they describe something closer to what those 2 hours actually were. The food situation inside the perimeter is documented with enough specificity in the medical records to make the caloric arithmetic precise. The 101st's medical staff estimated daily caloric intake during the siege at approximately 1,800 to 2,000 calories per man, roughly half the authorized ration of 3,600 calories for a soldier in active operations. Over 7 days, this deficit accumulates to a measurable physical effect, estimated weight loss of 5 to 7 pounds per soldier, on top of the energy expenditure of combat operations and cold weather survival. The soldiers who held the Bastogne perimeter through December 26th were not the same physical specimens as the soldiers who arrived on December 19th. They were lighter, more fatigued, operating at a sustained physical deficit that the adrenaline of danger could partially mask but not eliminate. The relief that arrived through the Assinois corridor on December 26th didn't just bring ammunition and plasma, it brought food. The can of fruitcake that appears in several accounts of Christmas morning inside the perimeter, produced from someone's pack, shared among 5 or 6 men in a position somewhere in the 506th sector, has become, in the retelling, a small symbolic moment. What I find more interesting than its symbolic dimension is its logistical one. That the can existed at all means someone had been carrying it since Reims, through the truck journey north, through the confusion of December 19th, through a week of defensive fighting in which everything non-essential was discarded. The fruitcake survived in someone's pack through all of that. It was described by the men who ate it as terrible. Everyone ate their portion anyway. There is a specific human quality to that detail, the maintenance of a small domestic ritual in conditions that had stripped everything else away, that the official record doesn't know how to record. The letters home do. Sometimes that's the best evidence we have. Chapter 13. The Corridor War. 03:45 hours, the 27th of December, 1944. Somewhere on the Assinois Road, roughly 2 kilometers south of Bastogne. The Third Army, G3. Operations log entry for this moment is brief and administrative, in the way that urgent things get recorded when there isn't time for anything else. Corridor Assinois to Bastogne, cut by enemy infantry attack. Estimates 2 companies' strength. Status, closed. Disposition, counterattack ordered. Less than 12 hours after Lieutenant Bulge shook hands with Lieutenant Webster. Less than 12 hours after the supply trucks had pushed their first loads north and the wounded had been carried south. The corridor that had taken 10 days and hundreds of casualties to open was closed again before dawn by 2 companies of German infantry who had simply walked onto the road in the dark and made themselves an obstacle. A supply convoy scheduled to move north at 0400 hours waited in the snow. The drivers sat in their cabs and watched the horizon for muzzle flashes and did not move forward. The popular account of the Bastogne relief ends at 1650 hours on December 26th. This is understandable. The handshake between Bulge and Webster is a clean, photographable moment of resolution. The siege ends. The narrative ends. The documentary fades to credits. What this framing omits is a week of fighting that was, in some respects, more demanding than the advance itself. Opening a corridor through an encircling force is a specific military problem with a defined solution. Advance until contact is made. Holding a corridor open against a force that knows exactly where it is, how wide it is, and how critical it is to the defenders inside, that is a different and in some ways harder problem. The Germans didn't need to re-encircle Bastogne completely. They only needed to cut the road long enough to interrupt the supply flow. They tried this at least twice in the 72 hours after the breakthrough, and both times they came close enough that it wasn't comfortable. The German response to the Assinois breakthrough on December 26th was both faster and more organized than many accounts acknowledge. Von Manteuffel, receiving word of the corridor by late evening, immediately ordered available reserves toward the road. The specific formations available were elements of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and the Führer Begleit Brigade, neither a first-rate formation by the standards of the German Army's best units, but both capable of sustained infantry and armored action at the tactical level. Their orders were to sever the Assinois road and restore the encirclement. The attempt on the night of December 26th into December 27th succeeded in closing the road, at least temporarily. The Third Army's counterattack reopened it by approximately 0900 hours. In the 5-hour window, no convoy moved. The 101st's artillery was back on ration fire by dawn. Here is the technical reality of what holding the corridor actually required. The Assinois road was not a highway. It was a single-lane Belgian farm road that ran north through a landscape of small fields, hedgerows, and patches of forest. Exactly the kind of terrain that favored infantry ambush over armored movement. A Sherman tank on that road occupied essentially the entire usable width, which meant the following vehicle was blind to anything the lead tank was seeing until the lead tank either stopped or was hit. The infantry protecting the road's flanks had to be positioned far enough from the road to provide meaningful warning of approaching German forces, but close enough to the road to reinforce it quickly if attacked. In December temperatures, infantry positioned in the open field flanks of a road corridor needed fires, shelter, or frequent rotation to remain effective, none of which were readily available on a road that was simultaneously carrying northbound supply convoys and southbound casualty evacuations around the clock. The soldiers holding the corridor were, in effect, living on the road itself, sleeping in vehicles or in ditches, eating what the supply trucks brought past them. The German counteroffensive that began around the 30th of December and ran through the first days of January is the phase of the Bastogne battle that most English-language histories treat as a relatively straightforward Allied defensive success, and the German operational records suggest it was considerably less straightforward than that. Two fresh German armored formations, the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Führer Begleit Brigade, attacked from the northwest against the Bastogne perimeter and the western side of the corridor simultaneously. The 4th Armored Division, which had arrived at Bastogne with approximately half its original tank strength after the approach march, was now holding a defensive perimeter it had been designed to attack through. General Gaffey requested reinforcements from 3rd Army. 3rd Army requested them from the 12th Army Group. The 12th Army Group, managing simultaneous crises across a front that was still not fully stabilized, had nothing immediately available. The 4th Armored held the corridor with the tanks it had, which were fewer than doctrine required and fewer than the situation demanded. The Luftwaffe's Operation Bodenplatte on the 1st of January 1945 has a strange dual character in the record. More than 800 German aircraft attacked 27 Allied airfields simultaneously in the largest German air operation since the Battle of Britain. The tactical results were significant. The American and British official report acknowledged 127 aircraft destroyed on the ground, though a subsequent 1946 analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey put the figure at 305. The close air support that had been available to the 4th Armored's advance since December 23rd was reduced for approximately 48 hours at the precise moment the German ground counteroffensive was at its peak intensity. The road was harder to hold without the P-47s overhead. For those 48 hours, the corridor existed on the strength of the infantry and armor holding it, without the air cover that had become a functional component of 3rd Army's tactical system since the weather broke. It held. But Bodenplatte's timing, coinciding with the German ground counteroffensive, was not accidental. It was coordinated, and the coordination nearly worked. When I was reading through the 9th Tactical Air Command's operational summaries alongside the 4th Armored's daily strength reports from the first week of January, the convergence of reduced air support and reduced armor strength in the same 72-hour window seemed to me one of the closest calls of the entire Bastogne operation. The corridor was never more vulnerable than in the period from January 1st to January 3rd. German ground pressure from the northwest, reduced air cover from Bodenplatte's aftermath, the 4th Armored Division at perhaps 40% of its authorized tank strength. What kept the corridor open in that window was a combination of Abrams's defensive positioning. He had spent the days since December 26th methodically establishing interlocking fields of fire and pre-planned artillery concentrations for all likely German approach routes, and the specific resilience of the armored infantry who were holding the corridor's flanks on foot in weather that was working against everyone equally. Patton's response to the deteriorating situation in early January reveals something important about how he operated under pressure that didn't involve forward motion. He was not, by temperament, a commander comfortable with defensive operations. His entire professional identity had been built around offense, speed, and the exploitation of momentum. The defense of the Bastogne corridor was, by definition, reactive and positional, everything he disliked. His diary entries from the first week of January have a suppressed irritability that comes through clearly even in their compressed form. The First Army is still not attacking. Montgomery is still not attacking. The supply situation is still constraining his options, and here he is holding a road that he had expected, after December 26th, to be expanding into a full offensive operation. His response was to attack the problem at its geometric root. Rather than simply defending the corridor, he pushed Third Army's operations northwest to capture the high ground around Bourcy and Neuville that dominated the northern approaches to Bastogne. This expansion of the perimeter, which cost approximately 3,000 additional casualties between January 3rd and January 9th, finally made the Bastogne position tactically stable in a way that defending the corridor alone never could have achieved. The supply figures for the corridor's first 2 weeks are, in their own way, a record of how close the margin actually was. Between December 26th and January 9th, the Third Army pushed approximately 2,400 tons of supplies per day through the Assenoy Road, roughly half the theoretical capacity of the route, due to the need to share road space with combat units, medical evacuation traffic, and the periods when German action closed the road entirely. The 101st Artillery, back to something approaching normal consumption rates by January 3rd, was burning through ammunition at a rate that required continuous resupply to maintain. Every convoy that made the trip north did so on a road that was under intermittent German fire along multiple segments, with no guarantee of arrival and a schedule that was more aspiration than certainty. The drivers who ran those convoys in the first 2 weeks of January have no collective name and no individual citation in the popular history of the battle. The supply logs record their tonnages. That is the extent of their memorial. The Battle of the Bulge was officially declared over on January 25, 1945. The Bastogne corridor had been open, tenuously and under sustained pressure, for 29 days by that point. The town itself had been fought over, supplied through a single road, and expanded into a stable position by increments that cost more than the initial relief. The total American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, approximately 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing across the entire Ardennes front, are a figure that appears in every general account of the battle and carries less emotional weight than it should, because large numbers have a way of becoming abstract. The Corridor War's specific contribution to that total is not separately tallied. It is folded into the aggregate, the way that all the hardest parts of the least glamorous work eventually disappears into the summary result. Chapter 14. The weather clears, the myth forms. The 27th of December, 1944. A wire service dispatch filed from somewhere near Third Army headquarters clears the military censors and begins moving toward newspaper offices in New York, Chicago, and 100 smaller cities and towns. The correspondent is accurate about the essentials. Bastogne has been relieved. German forces have been pushed back. An American garrison that had been surrounded for more than a week is no longer cut off. He reports the relief as occurring on Christmas Day. The relief occurred on December 26th. The discrepancy is 1 day. The censors who reviewed the dispatch before transmission were tasked with operational security. No unit identifications, no geographic specifics that might assist German intelligence. They were not tasked with factual accuracy. The date error wasn't their problem to correct, and it wasn't corrected. Within 48 hours, the relief of Bastogne had become, in the public mind, a Christmas story. It would stay a Christmas story for 80 years. The myth didn't require a conspiracy. It didn't need anyone to deliberately falsify anything. It formed the way myths form, when accurate information meets the narrative expectations of its recipients, through the accumulated small choices of people who knew what a good story looked like, and recognized, correctly, that this was one. The Bastogne story had every element the wartime American public needed in December of 1944. Surrounded soldiers, a defiant general, a one-word reply to an enemy ultimatum, a relief column racing through winter. And it needed very little embellishment to carry emotional weight. What it didn't need, and what the journalistic accounts accordingly didn't provide, was complexity. The contingency planning that had been running since December 12th, the intelligence analysis that had been building since November 23rd, the logistics operation that had moved 63,000 tons in 5 days. These are not storytelling material. They are management material, and management doesn't make the front page. The specific account of the Verdun Conference that shaped the popular understanding of the entire operation appeared in multiple press treatments within days of the relief. Patton had announced he could attack with 3 divisions. Everyone in the room was astonished. He had transmitted a code word, and the army had moved. This account is not false, exactly. It is true in the way that a photograph of a finished building is true. It captures something real while omitting everything that happened before the shutter opened. The code word was sent from Verdun on the morning of December 19th. The first column had departed at midnight on December 18th. The contingency plans had existed since December 12th. The intelligence assessment that made those plans logical had been building since November. None of this appears in the press coverage from late December, not because it was suppressed, but because nobody in the press corps knew to look for it. They had the surface of a dramatic story. The archive was underneath it. Patton's press conference on December 29, 1944, is one of the more instructive primary source moments of the entire operation, for what it reveals about how a commanding general manages his own historical record in real time. His diary entry for the same day states that he told the reporters the whole story. The press conference transcript shows something different. Patton was quotable, engaging, and selective. He credited the men of the Third Army. He praised the fighting quality of the 4th Armored. He did not explain the December 12th contingency planning. He did not mention Koch. He did not mention Gay. He did not mention Mueller. The diaries claim that he told the whole story, and the transcripts evidence that he didn't are not compatible. And this incompatibility is worth sitting with. It suggests that even in his private record, the document he ostensibly kept for himself, Patton was managing a narrative. His diary is a remarkable document in many respects. It is not, in all respects, a reliable one. The gap between Patton's diary and the press conference transcript is a small example of a larger phenomenon that shapes the entire historiography of the Bastogne operation. The men who made the decisions wrote the first drafts of the history, in memoirs and diaries and official reports, and those first drafts emphasized what those men wanted preserved. Patton wanted the image of inspired command preserved. Bradley wanted the image of strategic soundness preserved. Montgomery wanted the image of professional caution vindicated. The soldiers who drove the tanks and strung the wire and moved the supply convoys didn't write memoirs. The staff officers who built the contingency plans mostly didn't write memoirs. The result is a historical record that is weighted toward the famous names and the dramatic moments, because those are the people who had both the motivation and the opportunity to write down what happened before anyone else could disagree. The process by which the official history eventually corrected the popular account is worth tracing, because it took decades and produced a record that is far better than the popular understanding has ever become. Dr. Hugh Cole began his research for the Army's official history of the Ardennes campaign in the late 1940s, working through captured German records, conducting interviews with participants on both sides, and cross-referencing operational logs against personal accounts. His research notes, held at the U.S. Army Military History Institute at Carlisle, contain instances of primary sources directly contradicting the published press narrative from December 1944. The contingency planning. The pre-movement on the night of December 18th. The role of Koch and Gay. Cole's published volume, released in 1965, is scrupulous, footnoted, and correct about most things the press coverage got wrong. It sold modestly. The George C. Scott film Patton was released in 1970. It won 8 Academy Awards and was seen by an estimated 50 million people in its first decade. The contest between the careful historical record and the dramatic narrative was decided, without any formal announcement, by those numbers. What fascinates me about the myth formation process in the Bastogne case is that it wasn't completed by a single dramatic falsification. It was completed by the gradual convergence of dozens of small framings. The one-day date error, the omission of the contingency planning, the compression of the Verdun Conference into a single inspirational moment. Each individually defensible, collectively distorting. By the time the popular understanding of the Bastogne relief had solidified, in the early 1950s, it was a story about one man's genius and one garrison's stubbornness. Both elements were real. The story was also missing Koch and Gay and Muller and Abrams and Boggess and Webster and the 254 jumbo Shermans and the 57 tons of maps and the 3 notations of "no more morphine" and the 11 names in the Belgian municipal death register. The myth kept the dramatic elements and shed the complex ones, because that is what myths do. The Nuts reply itself underwent a quiet transformation in transmission that the historical record preserves, but that most accounts of the reply pass over. McAuliffe's handwritten original, 3 inches by 5.5 inches, held at the National Infantry Museum, reads, "To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander." The typed official version created for transmission through the formal record reads, "To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander." A comma and an exclamation mark in the handwritten version, a colon in the typed version. These are not the same punctuation marks. The comma and exclamation version is slightly looser, slightly more improvisational, capturing something of the moment's texture, a man waving away an irritation rather than issuing a formal declaration. The colon version is more declarative, more emphatic, more monument-worthy. The typed version is the one that got reproduced in the press releases and the history books. The handwritten version, the actual document, the thing that actually existed in McAuliffe's hand on December 22nd, is in a museum case in Georgia. The colon is in the mythology. The comma is in the archive. The Bastogne myth's most enduring distortion is the date compression that turned December 26th into Christmas Day. This single-day error isn't trivial, because it isn't just a calendar mistake. It reshapes the entire emotional architecture of the story. A relief that arrives on Christmas Day is miraculous, seasonally, symbolically, almost liturgically correct. A relief that arrives on December 26th is still extraordinary, still costly, still the product of exceptional military and human effort. But December 26th is the day after Christmas. It doesn't have Christmas's symbolic weight. The story needed the weight, and the date provided it. And by the time anyone was positioned to correct the error, the weight had been load-bearing for too long to remove without bringing the whole structure down. This is how myths work. Not through lies exactly. Through the selection of the details that the story needs, at the moment the story is still being assembled, before anyone has decided whether accuracy or resonance is more important. By early January of 1945, with the Battle of the Bulge still ongoing, and the corridor still requiring active defense, the Bastogne story was already substantially fixed in its popular form. Patton's genius, McAuliffe's defiance. The First Army of the Rhine waiting to be written. The men who had actually moved the 63,000 tons and strung the 20,000 miles of wire and driven the supply trucks through the corridor under fire at 0400 hours were becoming background. The unnamed, innumerable, necessary background against which the named and famous figures stood in sharper relief. This was not anyone's decision. It was the natural gravity of how human beings process large, complex events. We find the individuals we can name, and we use their names as handles for the things we can't hold otherwise. The archive resists this simplification. The archive insists on the 57 tons of maps. But the archive requires effort to read, and the myth requires only a screen. Chapter 15. Abrams, Patton, and the Question of Credit. January 1945. A ceremony somewhere near Third Army's forward command post. General George Patton is pinning a Distinguished Service Cross to the jacket of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. A photograph of the moment exists. Patton is smiling. It is a genuine smile, the smile of a commander acknowledging a subordinate whose performance has confirmed his own judgment in selecting and trusting that subordinate. Abrams's expression in the photograph is harder to read. It is attentive without being particularly warm. 40 years later, in an oral history interview conducted in the 1980s, Abrams described the relief operation in a sentence that I keep returning to. Patton had the idea. We had to make it work. Those are different jobs. Not a criticism, not false modesty, a description. The idea and the execution are different things, performed by different people with different demands, and neither is possible without the other. Abrams understood this with the clarity of someone who had done the execution. The distribution of credit in military history follows a rule that is nearly universal and almost never examined. Recognition flows toward rank. The higher the rank, the more certain the attribution. This is partly a function of how armies write their records. The commanding general's orders define the operation, so the commanding general's name attaches to it in the official record. It is partly a function of how military memoirs work. Generals write memoirs, colonels and majors mostly don't, and the primary sources for popular history are disproportionately drawn from the people with the rank and the leisure to produce them. And it is partly a function of how journalism works. The famous name is the story, and the staff officers who made the famous name's decisions possible are the background. The result is a historical record that systematically overstates the contribution of commanding generals and understates the contribution of everyone below them. This isn't unique to the Bastogne story. The Bastogne story is a particularly clear example of a general problem. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division during the entire relief operation, is the figure whose absence from the popular account is most structurally significant. Gaffey commanded the division. He made the decisions about how to allocate his 3 combat commands, which axes to prioritize, when to commit reserves, and how to balance the competing demands of speed and force concentration on a constrained road network. His operational choices, including the eventual decision to shift the main effort to Abrams's Combat Command Reserve when the other 2 commands were stalled, were the decisions that determined the shape of the relief march. They were made by Gaffey, executed by Abrams and the other Combat Command commanders, and credited in virtually every popular account to Patton. Patton gave the mission, Gaffey ran the mission. The division's own after-action report, which attributes tactical success specifically to Gaffey, Abrams, Ernest, and Dager, was not declassified for post-war publication until 1959, by which time the popular narrative had been fixed for a decade. The specific record of Abrams's performance in the final approach to Bastogne, from December 23rd through December 26th, is one of the most detailed first-hand accounts available for any aspect of the relief operation, and it consistently reveals a commander making decisions that were his own, rather than implementations of higher-order guidance. The selection of the Assinois route. The decision to use artillery suppression as the primary tool for village clearance, rather than tank infantry assault. The assignment of Cobra King, one of the few jumbo Shermans available, to the lead slot for the final push. The direction to Bogus to take the lead and not stop. None of these decisions appear in a higher headquarters order. They are the operational choices of a battalion and combat command commander working from mission-type orders that told him what to achieve and left the how to his judgment. The how was Abrams. The record says so clearly, and the popular account doesn't notice. The post-war memoir literature is where the credit distortion is most visibly constructed, and I want to be precise about this rather than accusatory. Patton's posthumous memoir, War as I Knew It, was edited and published by his widow Beatrice from his diaries and dictated notes after his death in December 1945. It gives genuine credit to the 3rd Army staff and to the 4th Armored Division's performance. It is, within the constraints of its form, a reasonably honest document. But the contingency planning that began December 12th, the detail that most clearly establishes that the Bastogne pivot was planned rather than inspired, is compressed in the published version in a way that the full diary, which became accessible to researchers in stages through the 1970s, does not compress it. Beatrice Patton was editing her husband's legacy, as widows of famous men often do, and she made choices that the full diary record reveals were choices. The myth didn't require dishonesty. It required editorial decisions made by someone who loved the man being memorialized. Bradley's memoir treats the Bastogne operation as a validation of sound Army group management, the timely commitment of Patton's Army to the crisis, the correct identification of Bastogne as the essential objective. This is a defensible reading of events. It is also a reading that serves Bradley's institutional interests. because it frames the Bastogne relief as an achievement of his command structure, rather than an achievement conducted largely by people below him while he was managing the injury of the Montgomery decision. Bradley's memoir is a skilled, careful document written by a very intelligent man with a precise understanding of how historical memory is formed and a reasonable desire to appear in it favorably. Reading it alongside Coach's intelligence reports and Gay's diary and Muller's logistics summaries, you get a picture of the same events in which Bradley is more central and more agential than the operational record strictly supports. This is not lying. It is memoir. The genre has always worked this way. It fascinates me, going through the 4th Armored Division's own documentation from December of 1944, how completely the divisional record contradicts the popular account's implicit hierarchy of importance. The division's after-action report is a technically dense, operationally specific document that reads as though it was written by people who cared about accuracy more than narrative, which is, I think, exactly what it was. It contains detailed accounts of tactical decisions made at battalion and company level. It names Abrams, Erzik, Leach, Bogus, and a dozen other officers whose names appear in no popular history. It attributes specific tactical results to specific tactical choices by specific people. It is the closest thing available to an honest account of what actually happened, written by people who were there. It was declassified in 1959, 11 years after the war ended, 9 years after the popular narrative had solidified, 2 years after the monument at Bastogne had already been built, with its list of unit designations and its absence of individual names. The specific question of Abrams's recognition is instructive, not because it represents an injustice that needs correcting. History is full of uncorrected injustices, and an oral history interview conducted 4 decades later is a reasonable form of eventual acknowledgement. But because it reveals the structural mechanism by which military credit gets distributed. Abrams went on to command the Army in Vietnam, to become Army Chief of Staff, and to give his name to the M1 Abrams main battle tank, a naming that is, explicitly, a tribute to his performance in the Second World War, and specifically to his role in the Bastogne relief. The tank that bears his name has served in every major American military operation since its introduction in 1980. It is one of the most recognizable military vehicles in the world. Abrams received his recognition, eventually, accumulated by a lifetime of subsequent achievement, given institutional form posthumously through the naming of a weapons system. It is a different kind of recognition than a monument. It is also, in its own way, a more honest one. It attaches his name to capability rather than to a specific moment, which is probably closer to what he would have preferred. The men who drove the supply trucks through the Assinor corridor in the first week of January 1945 did not receive any subsequent recognition. Neither did the Signal Corps linemen who strung 20,000 miles of wire in December. Neither did Brigadier General Muller, who moved 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days. Neither did Colonel Koch, whose pencil ring around an absence on a map in November 1944 is the documentary origin of the entire operation. These men received the pay and benefits appropriate to their rank and service and were discharged at the end of the war. Their names are in the service records at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. They are not in the mythology, because the mythology was built on the principle that dramatic stories require a limited number of protagonists, and the logistics officer, and the intelligence officer, and the truck driver are not, by the conventions of dramatic narrative, protagonists. The archive disagrees. The archive puts them in every chapter. Chapter 16. Strategic Verdict. Did Bastogne matter? In 1965, 20 years after the battle ended, the U.S. Army's own official history of the Ardennes campaign was published. Dr. Hugh Cole had spent 16 years on it. It is a work of genuine scholarly rigor, sourced, footnoted, cross-referenced against German and American records with a patience that is, frankly, humbling to read alongside. The conclusion Cole reaches about the Bastogne operation contains a sentence that has never appeared in any popular account of the battle. I have been unable to find it quoted anywhere in the journalism, the documentary scripts, or the general histories that have appeared since 1965. The sentence is this: the failure to cut the salient at its base, in favor of the decision to relieve Bastogne, ensured that the German armies escaped westward with a cohesion that subsequent operations were required to break at additional cost. This is the Army's own historian, writing in the Army's own official publication, making an unmistakable critique of the strategic choices made in December 1944. It isn't a screaming indictment. It is a measured, careful, precisely worded observation. It has been sitting in a government publication for 60 years, largely unread. Cole's observation points to the debate that sits at the center of the entire Bastogne story and is almost never aired in popular accounts. Was the decision to relieve Bastogne, rather than cut the German salient at its base, the strategically optimal choice? The question sounds abstract until you understand what was actually being weighed. Patton's preferred option, advocated by his operations officer Maddox and discussed in the records of at least 2 separate planning sessions before December 19th, was a deep thrust southward toward Trier, aimed at the base of the German salient rather than at its current front edge. Such a thrust, if successful, would have threatened to encircle the German attacking armies west of the Rhine rather than simply stopping their advance and pushing them back. Von Manteuffel's post-war testimony is specific about this. He told Army historians that the base-cutting option was the scenario the German command feared most. He described it as the move that would have been catastrophic for German forces in the Ardennes, using the German word that translates more precisely as decisive defeat from which recovery is impossible. The argument against the base-cutting option is serious and has to be engaged honestly. Bradley's defenders, and Bradley himself in his memoir, argue that the option was operationally infeasible, given the actual force dispositions in December 1944. The German salient was roughly 60 miles wide at its base. A thrust aimed at cutting it would have had to travel through heavily defended terrain against German forces that were, in the early days of the operation, still advancing with considerable momentum. The American forces available for such a thrust were the same divisions Patton committed to the Bastogne relief, and those divisions, as the 4 days of the 4th Armored's approach march demonstrated, were capable of advancing roughly 20 to 25 miles per day against prepared opposition. A 60-mile thrust against a moving, reinforced German line was not obviously executable in the time frame that would have made encirclement possible. This is a real argument. The base-cutting option wasn't simply rejected by timid commanders. It was assessed, by people with access to the actual operational picture, as a risk that the available forces might not be able to execute successfully. But here is what the post-battle record adds to that assessment, and why Cole's sentence carries the weight it does. The German forces that Patton did not encircle, because the decision was made to relieve Bastogne rather than cut the salient, did not simply disappear. They retreated eastward through January of 1945, reorganized on the Rhine, and established defensive positions that the Allied armies then had to break through at additional cost in February and March. The combat soldiers who fought those February and March actions were paying, in casualties and time, for the German cohesion that the January retreat had preserved. The battles of Remagen, the Rohr River crossings, the Rhine crossing operations, all of them were against an enemy that had been defeated in the Ardennes, but not destroyed there. The additional cost Cole refers to is real, measurable in the casualty records for the first quarter of 1945, and directly attributable to the German army's ability to withdraw intact from the Bulge salient. The northern counterattack delay, Montgomery holding from December 26th to January 3rd, is the other half of this strategic calculation, and the two elements have to be understood together. If Patton had pursued the base-cutting option and Montgomery had attacked simultaneously from the north, the German armies in the salient would have faced coordinated pressure from 2 directions against their supply lines at the same moment their offensive was failing. This is the scenario that would have produced the encirclement that von Manteuffel feared. It didn't happen because the Allied command made 2 separate decisions: Bastogne, rather than the salient space in the south, the deliberate pause, rather than immediate attack in the north, that were individually defensible and collectively insufficient for maximum strategic effect. No single decision was obviously wrong. The combination of decisions was strategically suboptimal. The official history says so. The popular accounts do not. I want to be careful here about what I am and am not arguing, because this is the place in the analysis where it's easiest to slide from honest assessment into retroactive certainty. The commanders who made these decisions, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, Montgomery, were operating under genuine uncertainty, genuine time pressure, and genuine political constraint. They did not have the benefit of Cole's 16 years of archival research. They had fragmentary intelligence, exhausted formations, a command structure that was simultaneously managing a crisis and managing itself, and the legitimate moral weight of knowing that the Bastogne garrison was composed of real men who were dying while the strategic options were being debated. The decision to relieve Bastogne was, in human terms, the right decision. The decision that a military command that valued its soldiers' lives was bound to make. The strategic cost of that decision was real and was paid by different soldiers in a different season. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and a history that acknowledges only the first is incomplete. The American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, approximately 80,000 across the entire Ardennes front between December 16, 1944 and January 25, 1945, make it the single costliest American military operation of the Western European campaign. The German casualties are estimated at somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000, the range reflecting genuine uncertainty in the German records rather than imprecision in the research. What these numbers don't convey, but the operational records do, is the specific quality of the German losses compared to the American ones. The Americans lost men and equipment that the United States industrial system could replace, quickly and in volume. The Germans lost men and equipment, particularly the irreplaceable experienced officers and NCOs who had survived to December of 1944, that Germany's shrinking manpower and collapsing industrial base could not replace. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last offensive operation in the West. After it failed, the Wehrmacht in the West was reduced to reactive defense that became, progressively and then rapidly, retreat and collapse. This outcome was achieved at a cost that the soldiers who paid it were right to find grievous. It was also the outcome. These are not contradictory statements. The Battle of the Bulge ended the German ability to conduct offensive operations in the West. This is the achievement, and it is a complete and decisive one. The manner of achieving it, the decision to relieve Bastogne rather than encircle the attacking German armies, is a separate question from whether the achievement was real. Cole's sentence doesn't say the relief of Bastogne was wrong. It says the choice entailed a cost. The cost was borne by soldiers in February and March of 1945, who are not part of this story's popular telling, who fought in operations without famous names, or famous generals, or famous one-word replies to ultimatums. They are in the casualty records. They are in their families' memories. They are not, for the most part, in the monument. The archive puts them in a footnote. Cole's sentence acknowledges that they are there. What Bastogne ultimately produced, beyond its specific military result, was a demonstration of organizational resilience under conditions that should, by any reasonable pre-war analysis, have made organized resistance impossible. A garrison assembled from disparate units, without adequate supplies or winter equipment, surrounded by a numerically superior enemy in weather that grounded its most powerful supporting arm, held a position for 7 days, and then received a relief force that had been assembled, pivoted, and driven north in a logistics and command performance of extraordinary competence. This combination of events, the defense and the relief, was the product of an institutional military culture that had been built over years of training, doctrine development, and the hard education of 2 years of combat. It was not spontaneous. It was not miraculous. It was the result of professional soldiers doing their professional work at the edge of what professional work can achieve. That is both a more modest and a more honest tribute than the version that ends with Christmas skies clearing over Belgium. Chapter 17. The Long Road Home. Legacy, Memory, and what Bastogne means in 2026. Every year on the 16th of December, in the town square of Bastogne, Belgium, a ceremony is held to mark the opening of the German Ardennes offensive. The mayor reads names from the municipal death register, the names of the civilians killed in December of 1944, the names that appear in no American military document. The names are read in French, in the flat, careful cadence of a civic official performing a civic duty. For most of the ceremony's history, the American veterans present, the men from the 101st Airborne, from the 4th Armored, from the dozens of attached units that passed through Bastogne in those weeks, didn't know whose names were being read. Not because they were indifferent, because nobody had told them. The gap between the ceremony the Americans came to attend and the ceremony the Belgians were conducting is not a gap of hostility or misunderstanding. It is a gap between two honest memories of the same events, held by people who experienced those events from positions so different that the overlap was never guaranteed. Patton died on December 21, 1945. He had been injured in an automobile accident in Mannheim, Germany on December 9th, a non-combat collision. His staff car struck by a military truck at a road junction. He lingered for 12 days and died without regaining full capacity. He was 60 years old. The timing of his death, 1 year and 5 days after the Third Army's columns began moving north toward Bastogne, meant that the man who might have written the fullest, most operationally specific account of the relief operation was dead before he could write it. The posthumous memoir, assembled from diaries and dictated notes by his widow, is the document we have. It is not the document he would have written himself. The distinction matters because Patton was, in his private diaries, more analytically honest than his public image suggested, more willing to acknowledge mistakes, more willing to credit subordinates, more interested in the operational mechanics than the dramatic narrative. The memoir that carries his name captures some of this. It misses more than it captures. The gap between the archival Bastogne and the mythological Bastogne was fixed into its final form by the George C. Scott film of 1970. This is not the film's fault. It was a drama, not a documentary, and it achieved its dramatic purposes with considerable skill and with a genuine seriousness about its subject that distinguishes it from most military films of its era. But 50 million viewers saw the Verdun conference scene in the first decade of its release. And what they saw was a spontaneous announcement of capability rather than a confirmation of a contingency already in execution. They saw the dramatic moment, not the December 12th planning session that made the dramatic moment possible. Hugh Cole's corrective, sitting in a government publication released 5 years before the film, had reached a fraction of 1% of the audience the film would eventually reach. This is not an argument against dramatic filmmaking. It is an observation about how historical understanding is actually formed in a mass media culture, and about the specific responsibility that bears on documentary work that wants to do something different. The Martissan Memorial, the American monument at Bastogne, was completed in 1950. It is a 5-pointed star shape, 30 meters tall, built in Belgian limestone. On its inner walls are inscribed the names of the 48 American states. Alaska and Hawaii had not yet achieved statehood when the monument was designed. And the unit designations of every American formation that fought in the Bastogne area. 3rd Army is there. 4th Armored Division is there. The 101st Airborne is there. Creighton Abrams's name is not inscribed anywhere on the monument. Oscar Koch's name is not there. Hobart Gay's name is not there. Walter Muller's name is not there. Bruce Finchel's name, the private who hid in a Belgian attic and listened to German soldiers singing on Christmas Eve, is not there. The monument records formations rather than people, a choice that is architecturally honest about how armies function and simultaneously silent about how armies are actually run. The people who ran the army at Bastogne are in the archives. The archives are in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in College Park, Maryland, in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and Freiburg, Germany, and in a small museum case in Columbus, Georgia, where McAuliffe's handwritten reply to the German surrender demand is preserved, with its comma and its exclamation mark, the punctuation that got changed in transcription, the detail that the archive preserved, and the mythology smoothed away. The ongoing digitization of Second World War personal documents, letters, diaries, photographs, unit histories assembled by veterans associations in the years after the war, is, as of the mid-2020s, an archival emergency in the literal sense. The National World War II Museum estimates that roughly 70% of the personal documentation from the Bastogne siege has never been formally cataloged. It exists in attics and shoeboxes and estate sale boxes, held by the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of men who were in those foxholes and on those roads and in those farmhouse aid stations in December of 1944. Every year, with the death of each family member who remembers where the box is kept and what's in it, some of that material disappears into landfills or recycling bins, or simply the accumulation of time. The primary sources for a fully honest account of what happened at Bastogne are still being lost, 80 years after the events they document. Private Ballard's letter, the one that begins "Still Here" on its 4th page, survived because someone in his family kept it, and because a curator at the 101st Airborne Division Museum understood its significance when it was donated. It survived because of a chain of specific human decisions made across 80 years by people who had no way of knowing whether anyone would eventually care about a letter begun on December 21st and completed on December 26th by a private infantryman in a Belgian farmhouse. The archive is full of things that survived by chains of specific human decisions made under conditions of uncertainty. It is equally full of gaps, where the chain was broken and the document didn't make it. The history we have is the history of what was kept. The history of what was lost is, by definition, unavailable, and its shape can only be inferred from the edges of what remains. The Bastogne story has been told as a Christmas story, as a leadership story, as a logistics story, as a story about the limits of German strategic planning, as a story about the resilience of American military institutions, and as a story about the difference between winning a battle and achieving the maximum possible strategic result. It is, honestly, all of these things simultaneously. The Christmas story is real. The timing was what it was, and the symbolism that accrued to the timing reflected something genuine about what the garrison's endurance meant to the people following the war from home. The leadership story is real. Patton's contingency planning and Gay's execution and Abrams's tactical judgment were all genuinely remarkable, and together produced a result that the same assets, organized differently, might not have produced. The logistics story is real. Without Muller's 63,000 tons, none of the dramatic elements have anywhere to occur. The strategic limitation is real. Cole's sentence is in the archive, and it says what it says. What I find, having spent the length of this documentary with these documents and these men, is that the honest account is more interesting than the myth, not less. The myth requires a single hero and a single moment and a clean resolution. The archive requires multiple people doing different kinds of work at different levels of visibility, some of it glamorous and most of it not, in service of an outcome that was significant and costly and complete and imperfect in the specific ways that consequential human endeavors are always imperfect. Koch's pencil ring around an absence is more interesting than a flash of inspiration. Gay's icy roads and slow artillery are more interesting than a dramatic announcement at a conference table. Finchel's can of peaches and Belgian attic are more interesting than any general's quotable quip. Mueller's 57 tons of maps are, in their own strange way, the most interesting detail in the entire operation, because they represent the specific, unglamorous, irreplaceable foundation on which everything else was built, and because nobody thought to mention them to the correspondent filing his dispatch on December 27th. The 26th of December, 1944, at 1650 hours, a jumbo Sherman tank sits in the snow outside a line of foxholes east of Bastogne. A lieutenant stands in the open commander's hatch, shouting into the gray Belgian afternoon. An engineer climbs from his foxhole and reaches up a hand. The handshake happens. The siege is over. This is real. This occurred. The archive confirms it at 1650 hours in the 4th Armored's log and at 1655 in the 101st. And the 5-minute gap between the two records is itself a small document about the nature of evidence. The moment is real and complete and historically decisive, and it is surrounded on all sides by the unglamorous, undramatic, essential work of people whose names are in the service records, and the supply logs, and the medical reports, and the personal letters that some of their grandchildren have kept, and some have not. The monument lists the formations. The archive lists the people. This documentary has tried to be the archive. Somewhere in Bastogne, on the night of December 26, 1944, after the convoy has come through and the wounded have been loaded and the corridor is tenuously, impermanently, successfully open, someone turns off a light. Not a symbolic light, a generator light, in a farmhouse, because the fuel for the generator is needed elsewhere and the immediate crisis of the darkness has passed, because there are now supply trucks coming up the road. The generator shuts down. The room goes dark. Outside, in the snow, the army is still working. The trucks moving, the artillery counting its new shells, the signal wire running toward positions that didn't exist a week ago. The work continues in the dark the way work always continues, without ceremony, without a clean ending. Because the thing about wars is that they don't conclude at their most dramatic moment. They conclude later, more quietly, in the paperwork and the evacuations and the letters home that begin with, "Still here."